All right, everybody, welcome to another developer interview here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am Josh Beiser, and we have another amazing one lined up. My guests tonight are from Trans Solar Games. They are the developers of Hero U, Rogue to Redemption, as well as developers on the original Quest for Glory series, as well as other notable adventure games. So please welcome to the cast Corey and Lori Cole.
Hi there.
Hey, I'm Corey.
And I'm Lori.
There you go. It's great when the names rhyme. It helps in terms of these introductions.
Yeah, we used to call ourselves the Corey and Lori comedy duet.
It is a pleasure to have you both on. How are you doing? I know we're all been stuck inside for what seems like an eternity so far.
Yeah,
It's not that different for us anyway.
yeah I was going to say it's totally weird and crazy for us because it's exactly like the way we've been living like hermits for the last 15 years.
Yes. And we do our own development at home anyway. And this is pretty much how we ran Road to Redemption anyway.
Yeah, I think I went into a retreat around the time of 9/11. I've been hiding out ever since. We're just doing it a little more so now.
Yeah. And with what I do with Game Wisdom, I've been stuck inside regardless. So nothing's really changed around. It just means I have more time to do all these interviews and talks with developers.
We're just a little more nervous anytime we do have to go down.
Yeah.
That's the only difference. Yes, we work with a variety of people, and they've all been, for Road to Redemption, they were from Australia to New Zealand to New York, and so we're quite used to working remotely with people.
Florida and Washington and Paris for a short time.
Yeah, so
so
this is how we do our business.
yeah.
Yep. But it is great to have you both on. We've had a chance to talk with a lot of adventure game developers lately. Julia Minamata, Francisco, Dave Gilbert. I even had a Ron Gilbert on at one point when we were talking about
Nice.
Thimbleweed. So it's definitely an interesting time to talk about the adventure genre. And I'm glad to have you both on because one of the things I do want to discuss with you is kind of how things have changed from what many consider to be kind of the golden age of the adventure genre, the late 80s and the 90s, to where we're at today. And again, with both of you working on Quest for Glory and then moving to Hero U, of course, with the Kickstarter a few years ago, it's interesting to kind of see, how like design philosophies have changed.
Well, people sometimes ask me where all of our puns come from, and mine usually come from mishearing or misreading something. So as soon as you said adventure, and I heard Avengers, it reminded me that back in 1988, when I started Sierra Online, I was still programming in assembly language, and that immediately brings to mind the line, "Adventures assemble."
Okay. Thank you for that
So
anecdote.
I am no longer writing any code in assembly. In fact, I don't write a whole lot of code at all. Sierra had a in-house language called SCI that was actually, beneath the hood was written in C and assembly language. But SCI was a high-level custom scripting language that they used, and we developed something similar for U that we call Composer. And Lori does most of her work in Composer.
Yeah, the differences between now and then is that everybody's on their own right now. I mean, in the olden days, back when Sierra was alive or LucasArts was alive, you had this big corporation, an umbrella corporation that was feeding you money at that time and feeding you people to work with. You had no choice of who you were working with. You were assigned artists, you were assigned whatever they had, music people, and you had potluck.
But they had a large staff, several hundred full-time employees. So if they had a project that was falling behind, they would sometimes shift people from one project to another to fill the seats and hopefully speed it up a little.
But likewise, if you were not the A game, you got the B team of artists and things, and you just worked with what you got. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, pretty much everybody that's doing adventure games is having to be on their own and do it all themselves.
Yeah, King's Quest V was a good example of that in 1990. That it was, the premier game from Sierra, their flagship product, and it was running months behind schedule. They'd just switched over to 256 color VGA and point and click. And so they basically stripped every other team in the company and put everybody on Quest for Glory 5 for a time. Our game, we were working, King's Quest 5. King's Quest 5, sorry. Yes. King's Quest 5. We were working on Quest for Glory 2 at the time, and actually our team was the only one that stayed relatively intact because we had a pretty good shot at actually getting the game out in time for Christmas, and they said they needed something out, so they got Quest for Glory 2 out with the old technology, and a month later they got King's Quest 5 out with new technology, and we visually suffered in comparison, but both games actually did pretty well in hindsight. At the time, we were horrified. It's like our game is just going to be lost in the shuffle.
And it kind of was, comparatively.
Comparatively.
Yeah. And it's such a different market today than it was, again, 20, 30 years ago. Like, we always talk about, like, for, like, the younger and the new people in the industry, just how quickly things have changed in terms of what it means to make games. And just, like, just, like, kind of, like, get influenced by them now.
Well, when we first came out with adventure games was when the computer markets were new, and actually the software was driving the market. People wanted to buy the computers that could play these impressive adventure games, and they wanted the adventure games to show off their computer. So games like Myst, which are graphically beautiful games, sold so well because every company that tried to sell, every store ran it on their screens. Likewise, when King's Quest V came out, every store out there ran it on their screens to show off the power of the computer and the beauty that the games could be. And so therefore, it was a ready market.
Yeah, so we were really only 10 years into the personal computer revolution we started. As I said, I started Sierra at 88. 78 was still the beginning of the Apple II, and people were still using CPM machines and stuff like that. Floppy disks were a relatively recent innovation in 78. So, crazy. And when we started Sierra, not everybody had hard drives in the computer.
Right.
So a lot of people actually played from the floppies.
And they had to, and so that's why our first game shipped with how many floppies?
I think it was eight or nine floppies.
And you'd have to shift floppies whenever you went to a different location, different basic area. So it was a totally different way of playing, too.
Mm-hmm. We had the low density 5.25 inch floppies in the PC were 360K, and a lot of the content of the game had to be repeated on every disk. Mm-hmm. So all the system code and all the graphics for like the main character, reaching out or walking and so on, all had to be on every single one of the floppies. And so there was like 100K left for different codes. That's why it took so many. Probably would have fit on 3 or 4 floppies if it were being loaded onto a hard drive, but it took 9 to have new content in each one.
And the market out there was open. I mean, people wanted to buy these games, if nothing else, because this is what you had. You had really no options. There was no other kind of game out there. The genre was all adventure game for the most part. Mm-hmm. Yes. Slowly, it was etched away by things like Doom.
And of course, today people still want to play the game. Even so, everybody plays games. There's no real gamer anymore. Everybody's a gamer. The difference is that there are thousands of new games released every month. And being spotted, being visible in amongst those is really hard. So most of the people that I would say are playing our newer games, Hero Your Rogue Redemption, are actually people who know of us from the 90s, from Quest for Glory. And that, of course, is a constant frustration to us because we think we're making some pretty cool and fun games that an awful lot of people would enjoy, but they're hard to find.
Yeah, it's definitely been a tough time for a lot of developers. Like I was telling you two before we started, I've been interviewing developers since 2012 in the independent space and some of the larger ones, and it's definitely become almost hit or miss for a lot of these games. Sharky, who is in my chat right now, we're working on a new video series talking about kind of like Indie Dev 101 for developers starting out in terms of what to think about, what to kind of prepare for when it comes to getting into this industry. And it is such a sharp turn from what it was back in the day. I mean, I started playing games back in 1988. And like back then, you buy a game, that's it for like a month or two. Like you're not finding another game for some time. And like
Yeah, I attempted. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
oh, I was going to say, like today, like we do a weekly show, and there's a good 50 to 60 games coming out each week, and that's just on Steam alone. Like that's not even getting to the consoles and mobile.
Yeah. There's just a huge variation in the I wanted to, I could say the quality, but I don't even have to use that word, but the sophistication and complexity of different games.
Yeah.
So there are games that are put out by one person with a month or two's work, and there are games that are put out by teams of hundreds of people or even 1,000 people that have worked on it for 3 to 5 years and longer. So our games are somewhere in between. Hero U Rogue Redemption, we started out with a Kickstarter in 2012, but Lori and I had been, doing conceptual design for it for about 5 years before that, or more. And that game actually took us 5.5 years to complete with a team that averaged about 10 or 12 people at any given time. There's about 50 people on the team altogether, some of them just coming in to do a few pieces of art and so on, and then leaving, and other people on for the whole time. And that's a major effort. That was, it was $1 million development thing. So Steam recently released some statistics on games launched over the last few years, and they consider to be a success a game that sells, I think it was $10,000 worth in the first 3 weeks, something like that. And relatively, that is a success. If you're a hobbyist that has worked for a few months on a game and puts it out on Steam, if you can make $10,000 in a few weeks, then you're pretty pleased. And unfortunately, that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. Awful lot of games on Steam do not make that milestone. But if you're a team of 50 people that have worked in a game for 5 years, you look at 10,000 or 100,000 and say, that's not enough to pay anyone. So it's a really tricky market to decide of what kind of game you want to make. And with us, we're kind of predefined because our fans of our very complex adventure role-playing games, the Quest for Glory series and Shannara and Gospel Dr. Brain and so on that we made in the 90s, want games like that. And that's the kind of games we like to make. So we predefined that we were going to make a very complex, sophisticated game that would require a lot of assets and a lot of time and work. And the question is, can we find the market to justify that? So far, answer is no. But we have a lot of rabid fans. We've sold well over 10,000 copies, and that's a massive hit by indie standards. But for our MIDI, I guess we call ourselves a MIDI game. We're somewhere in between indie and AAA, and it's an uncomfortable space. But I'm told that actually all the spaces are uncomfortable.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Also, just as a quick tangent, did you retweet the announcement on Twitter? Because I didn't see anything pop up there, and we are going to be taking questions from the audience. So if you missed anybody,
in theory, I tweeted on both my personal and company account.
Yeah, I did on mine.
Okay.
Your tweet I was mentioned in less than an hour. Is there a newer one?
Yeah, I made one just as we started, saying that we're about to begin with. I did to the Trans Solar games to that Twitter.
Okay.
Notifications to Trans Solar games.
Yeah, we'd like people to actually see this.
Yeah.
It's part of who the whole point.
It's important to have people when you're doing a talk. My audience knows that I'll just like talk. I don't care if anyone's there. I'll just like have an hour-long rant about game design. You don't even need to like give me a topic. Just like if you watch me long enough, I'll just start ranting.
We're good at that too.
Yeah. Anyway, I did tweet right after, right about the same time, 4 minutes or 2 minutes after you tweeted your thing. I did not retweet yours. I can retweet yours.
Retweet. Yeah, there we go.
Sure, why not?
We
Retweet.
go.
Do that
Yeah.
social media thing everyone knows
Yeah,
and
yeah.
loves.
Yes, and that's the trick that in the bad old days of Sierra, which was the highlight of adventure games, of course, you had a massive marketing team.
That's the good old days. We got to be
Really, yeah.
politically correct here.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's all a matter of interpretation. I mean, and at that point, everybody wanted the latest game. There was only going to be 1 or 2 games coming out any time, given time. And
Yeah, so we're like, 50 major titles released in a year, as opposed to in a week.
And so everybody was excited. And of course, you had these professionals, or so-called everybody in the game industry called themselves a professional, and nobody knew what they were doing because it was, and it still is, pioneering. It's, you've got to figure out what you're doing as you do it, and you learn as you go.
So yeah, I kind of had a catchphrase because people would ask me, why our company made some incredibly stupid marketing decision, or why they had applied for a job and not even gotten a courtesy of response. So my line was, never make the mistake of assuming that anyone in the game industry is a professional, including me.
Yep. I think those are definitely words to live by when it comes to this industry.
That may still be true.
Yeah, I think it still is. I mean, and even this, with all the years and years of experience that we've had, we are constantly inventing and renewing and having to learn as we go. I mean, here for Transsolar Games and for Hero, we had to learn how to do media and how to try to advertise our stuff in addition to all the other stuff.
Yep.
And it's rough. And
even if you look at the major game companies, the AAAs, over the last 20 years, maybe longer, the story has been consolidation. Companies go out of business all the time. They get acquired by other companies. They merge in, and you basically, end up with a few very huge companies. And even those, a lot of the times are hurting to some extent. Activision doing pretty well, but they laid off 800 people last year while doing well.
Yeah, so it's a wild and woolly business. It is not for the faint of heart. I really try to say when anybody wants to get into this industry to have to realize this is rough. This is as tough and rough as any, the cutthroat Hollywood stories you ever hear.
Oh,
because it's, it's things like deadlines that you got to make, or if you can't make, you have to figure out how to get around them. And, there are all sorts of things.
Yep. And
let's see. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it's something that I'd like try to instill with people, especially like the first time indies or the students who watch me or read a lot of my writings about design, that, like you said, this is not easy to do. It's hard enough to make a game, let alone make one that's going to, financially support you. And
the trick is, unlike writing a book or writing a script for a Hollywood play, when you write those things, you are in control of the situation. In theory. You control the horizontal and the vertical. You have those characters, and you're going to put them through their paces and make them do what you want, even though sometimes they have a mind of their own and don't always do what you want them to. It's not like you're dealing with a bunch of players who may or may not want to do what you want them to do. For a game designer, you have to think of what the other person wants to do, not just what that character wants to do, but how that player wants to play that character, whether or not it's the same kind of character you wanted it to be.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, William Goldman wrote some books on screenwriting. There's Adventures in the Screen Trade and Which Lie Did I Tell? And one of his lines was, the first thing you have to understand about the Hollywood is that nobody knows anything. The which lie did I tell was a line straight out of a conversation he had a producer who'd been on the phone with someone and turned to Goldman and said, which lie did I tell? Because he wanted to be able to be consistent the next time he lied to the person.
Mm-hmm. And it's definitely just been a very interesting time in terms of just what this market has grown. As the two were saying a few minutes ago, like when we look on Steam or a major site these days, I can find a game that was made by a team of dozens of people. It took them 3, 5, 10 years. And then right next to that, I can find a game from somebody in 3, 5 months who did it on their own. And they could both be selling the game for a very similar price.
Yeah.
Yeah, the author of Flappy Birds actually took his own game off of Steam because he was disgusted by the fact that it sold huge numbers of copies and that he was getting rich from a little toy that he had kicked out in no time flat. And he just didn't think that was right, and he wasn't really interested in getting rich from it, so he withdrew it.
Most people
and
don't
then all the
have
clones
that theory.
appeared.
Yeah, most people won't go with that theory
Yep.
somehow. But yeah, it is. It's a wild and woolly west. And that's because now it isn't just a little niche market we're trying to sell to. It's the entire population of the world at this point. And everybody has different tastes and different things that they want to get from games. And so therefore, the market can have things like these, World of Warcraft versus Flappy Birds. It
versus Call of Duty.
Versus Call of Duty. All of those things have a market because there are so many people out there.
Oh, yes. And the very unique thing about the independent space that we've seen smaller developers just really kind of cultivate their own niches. If we look at something like Stardew Valley, for instance, that nobody at that time was thinking, let's make a farming simulator slice of life game. And
Farmville was out before that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I think Farmville came first.
Yeah, and Evolution, it really came out of, Animal Crossing too, the original Animal Crossing version. All of these things evolve as they go along. Most of our games, for instance, even in the Quest for Glory games, we were pulling from all of our, D&D stuff and the Ultima games. We were pulling from the history of that. And now nowadays we have so much more to pull from, and these games are evolving out of what was the past.
Yeah.
Yep.
And standing on the shoulders of giants. We're all influenced by what came before and what's going on simultaneously. I mean, we met with Ron Gilbert and I think Tim Schafer at Game Developers Conference in 1990 when they were working on Secret of Monkey Island. And Ron had played Heroes Quest, which is the original name of Quest for Glory, and he was talking to us about some things that he really liked in our games, and said, "Oh, I stole this thing from your game," and we said, "Oh, awesome, cool." And then he said, "Here's some things I'm doing." He said, "Oh, cool, we'll steal that." So there was that back and forth that people were creatively inspired by others, and especially those early GDCs were absolutely amazing in terms of the energy of everybody being there and everyone sharing. And
the thing with games, so much more than any other industry out there, is the people that still are doing games are people who are passionate about it, who love to actually play. Whereas in the old days at Sierra, most of those people hadn't played games. They were just hired. We came to this, this culture of Sierra, which was, isolated out in the wilds of Oakhurst, California, and we expected to see a little community of people that were like-minded and all who loved games and wanted to play games and things like that. And it was really surprising how many people there were not gamers at all.
Yeah, a year or two in, they hired Stuart as a producer, and Stuart later went on to Microsoft to run their games division. But he started up a little board gaming group And prior to that, basically nobody at Sierra was really getting together socially. And he used to take people up at extended lunches, a little picnic on the Fresno River and stuff like that, and things like that. So he really actually started making more sense of community there. But we'd been playing Dungeons and Dragons for years, and we assumed that gamers were D&D players, that we'd have no problem finding a D&D game at Sierra, and no, nobody gamed.
Yeah, very, very few. We had, but the point being is that nowadays, everybody who makes games pretty much plays them or has played them in the past. They're not there hired off the street because they might be a good artist. No, they had to want to be in the industry because otherwise they would, be sane. This is a crazy industry.
If Sierra could find a programmer or an artist or manager or whatever who lived in the Oakhurst area, that was a pretty small set to choose from, and they were happy to have them.
Mm-hmm.
We were imports from San Jose.
And like you said, it has changed so much in terms of the people getting in this industry. I've heard similar things from developers who've been around, who worked at major companies, and that it was pretty much more of the executive running the game than the developer. And it seems like that kind of philosophy is what kind of led to so many developers going into the independent space, where you are free to make the games that you want. You don't need to worry, at least to some extent, about the publisher over your head saying, we don't think this is going to sell right. Go change it to make it something more mass market friendly.
Yeah, we were lucky. We were there at the heyday of the adventure game, where the adventure game was the major genre, and so therefore we had the advantage that we weren't having to compete against every other company. And so when we made a game, it was going to actually have a chance to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And Sierra was in, initially in the state of chaos, where basically they brought us in there because I had written a D&D module called the Tower of Indomitable Circumstance. So I was a published author of Dungeons and Dragons modules, and together we published a newsletter called the Spellbook on fantasy gaming. So we had credentials as writers and so on. And they brought us in to do a role-playing game for Sierra, which had been strictly adventure games prior to that. And once in a while, I'd say about every 3 weeks or so, Ken Williams would wander by the development area and poke his head in and ask about what people were working on. And you always had to have a clean demo ready to show him with something new that he hadn't seen before. But the rest of the time, we were just totally left alone.
Yeah, that was the nice thing about Sierra, is that every team was pretty much, they did what they wanted to do, because there was nobody who knew anything about games there.
It lasted for 1 year.
Well, yeah, but even then, design-wise, I could pretty much do my own thing and create my own kind of game, which was this hybrid version of adventure game and role-playing game, because that was the D&D experience. I mean, it was what I wanted to play, the RPG style rather than the strict adventure game.
Yeah, nobody in management really looked at Laurie's writing or stories until 1990, 97 to 8, when they finally got around to looking at Quest for Glory 5 and discovered that she had some flirtatious dialogue in one of the characters, and said, "Oh, you have to rewrite that. We can't put that in Walmart with that Candy Radio Shack." So they forced her to take out some salacious dialogue, and
yeah, that was the only time I had management micromanaging my project,
and telling her to do rewrites. We had to re-record some of the voices because the executive, the general manager, didn't care for them. No, we didn't either, so that was fine.
Mm-hmm.
They had an actress who was speaking very real German in the game, and that was an accent you could cut with a knife. And we say, no, we don't want a real German. We want someone who gives the impression of being a German. They have a little bit of a cute German look to their voice. And that's what we ended up getting in the re-recording.
because actually you really have to have the actors be understandable by an American market who really doesn't have a trained ear for hearing the way Germans speak naturally.
And of course, nowadays I'm not even sure that's quite the right thing, because now games are truly international.
Yeah.
So Steam, they said that particularly for games that are localized into multiple languages, will typically get 40% of their sales in the U.S. Or in English language, and 60% in countries with all kinds of different languages. We're working on so a year and a half after, almost 2 years after the initial release of Goju Road to Redemption, we've just come out with a French translation. I still need to get the manuals translated. I kind of forgot. That's the problem with being in India, is you forget things. And we're working on German translation, possibly Chinese translation. I've had inquiries from a translator who wants to put us in Russian. So we would love to have the game out in a dozen languages. We have the budget for one or two.
And speaking about the whole translating games, that's another, I think, very interesting aspect, because I've spoken to some developers about that, and for some it's not that big of a deal. For others, again, especially adventure games with a lot of dialogue and vocals, it can be a nightmare in of itself to get that done right.
Yes, and in the case of our games, they're very, very much verbally oriented. It's a lot of the gameplay comes from interacting with different characters, talking to them, and getting them involved or doing things with them. And all of that means that we have a script the size of the late Harry Potter books.
Yep. So our high point for voice acting was 1995. Sarah came out with Quest for Glory 4, Shadows of Darkness, and it was still being released. It was 94. It came out on floppy disks. And the game had a QA cycle consisting of about a week or something like that.
Because it was competing with the King's Quest. They wanted both games out for Christmas.
So they rushed us out the door. The game was unplayable. And Sarah recognized that, and they also said, well, it really has to be a CD-ROM game. So to their credit, they actually assigned a couple new people. They assigned one of the programmers to stay on for close to a year. It was about 10 months. Fixing bugs, and went into the voice studio, and I actually got to work with amazing actors like Catherine Blorer and Jeff Bennett and John Rhys Davies, who's just unbelievable. And we had a all professional voice cast. The re-release on the CD-ROM version of Quest for Glory 4 is just absolutely amazing. The voice acting really adds to it.
As I was saying before, working for game companies and working in the game industry is a huge roller coaster ride. It has huge highs of when you have the chance to work like with John Rhys Davies for a voice acting and get to hear somebody bring these voices, these characters to life with their voice is just an awesome experience. And you have terrible lows, like the time that, okay, here you've been working on this game that's your baby, and it's finally out, and the first thing that happens is nobody can play it. It's terrible. It's a mess. It crashes in the first room. It's like, this is disaster time. There is nothing more demoralizing and more devastating to the soul than to see your game is a piece of crap. I mean, but you had both sides all constantly in this industry.
So Heroes Quest, 1 month before it was supposed to be released, had one scene of the game that if you didn't do things exactly the way the programmer had programmed them, crashed the game. And so I had to rewrite that, and they actually duplicated all of the floppies except for the one with that scene. And then after we went through about a day or two of QA on the changes I made, rushed out the final disc and got into the boxes and got the game out. Quest for Glory 2 is a game in which originally we had Fighter, Magic User, and Thief for the 3 classes. In Quest for Glory 2, you can become Paladin. But a few weeks before, about the time they were about to ship the game, there was a last-minute hold-up for a systems change, and I played through the game and discovered that it was actually impossible to become a paladin. If you qualified for paladin, it jumped you back to the beginning of the game and looped around, and you started the game over. So we barely managed to catch that before it shipped.
The problem was always our games were more complex than any other game that Sierra did. And it was always the case because we allowed people to play the type of character they wanted to play rather than tell a story with just, a major character. And so therefore they're convoluted. They're very complex. We let the player determine where they wanted to go, so you can't just have a straightforward, go here, 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 and have your QA test it that way. So we're just not very good at writing simple things.
Well, Sierra and LucasArts games at the time were very linear. Mm-hmm. They were basically telling a story, and you played through the story, and there was a very good reason for that. Leisure Suit Larry 2. I actually worked on extensively because I didn't work in the game itself, but I translated it to the Atari ST while Al Lowe was developing it. And so I got to play through the thing a lot. And he wrote it in sections. So you went into a town and, had 4 shops there and could interact with characters there, and that was about it. And then you got onto a cruise ship. And you couldn't leave the cruise ship until it did something, and then you went into the next scene on an island. And the reason he wrote it that way is because floppy disks, that people were still playing from floppies, and this way you didn't have to ever change back to a floppy disk you'd already played. So they were constrained by by the technological limits, and that actually informed the writing at the time.
And Al Lowe knew how to design a game for that restriction, whereas I didn't, and so therefore my games never really obeyed the rules that should have been down there because nobody knew what the rules were.
So basically, they brought me in there, and I worked on the SCI interpreter initially. I didn't work directly in the games, but that gave me an idea of what the capabilities were. They brought Lori in and say, "You're the director. Here's your team. Make a game."
Yes, a school teacher who had never actually, dealt with a team group or, was in a corporate setting before. It was like, okay, throw me in deep water, and I had to swim.
And we sold Sierra Management our proposal that had character classes that were a different race for each one. So you had a centaur archer, and you had the gnome thief, and I guess the human fighter or something like that. And just as we're about to put the team on starting production, after all the preliminary design's done, Bob Heitman, the development manager, takes us for a walk and says, "So, you have this player character centaur in the game. That's nice. I see the first room of your game has a set of steps." And it turns out the player didn't actually need to walk in those steps, but, he assumed you did. Up to the sheriff's office and says, "How do you think a horse walks up steps? Do you think it's like a human? Do you think our animation system is capable of a quadruped going up steps?" And we very rapidly ended up going from 4 different races and both genders and 8 different ways of playing the game to a male human character as the only character.
Yes. All right, that doesn't work.
That
doesn't work. That doesn't work. Well, let's make this thing work. So yeah, it's,
I think we had about 100 rooms in the game. That got stripped down to 50 very quickly.
No, it wasn't that. It was still awfully large. We'd had a lot of improvised rooms. I mean, that were
the forest rooms were small.
But really, a lot of game development is the art of improvisation, because you're constantly having new constraints and things that you have to work with, and you have to find a way to either work with them or work around them.
So the advent of the CD-ROM and later DVDs totally shook up the industry, because all of a sudden these developers that were making these small little compact games had the world's fair of amount of space available to them. And how do you fill that? How do you fill a CD? And everybody felt like they had to. And pretty soon they were filling multiple CDs with high-resolution artwork and movies and digital voice recordings and so on, and digital music. But basically, every time you take away a constraint, the developers feel like they, have to take advantage of all this power they have. So that's the problem today: is we have too much power available.
The players' expectations are so very high. I mean, they can play any kind of game that's been out there for years, and they can see how much quality has gone in, and they expect that out of everything.
Yeah. So Heroes Quest was, I guess, under 4 megabytes, and Hero Road Redemption was 3.5 gigabytes. And same type of game, but the art looks a whole lot better. And it's all 3D and a lot more scope.
It's supposed to be a reasonable scope when I started out. I think of these things as simple games, but
if we put voice acting in there and
really.
more animation, could have really been big. And once again, we didn't have a female protagonist, which we really want to have female protagonists.
Yeah, well, we get it in our next game. So
next game we finally managed it. Summer Days at Hero U is our first game. Well, you had a female protagonist in Mixed Up Fairy Tales.
I did, but you had a choice, yes. But the main character in Mixed Up
you never see the
Fairy
character.
Tales is not a character; is more of a player. So
yeah.
And
so one of the differences is we just have so much capacity that.
Capacity for what?
Just for the amount of memory, the amount of space, the quality of the graphics, the 3D open worlds, and you can't write enough content for all that.
Try me.
Yeah, back in.
It just takes forever.
Back in '99, we were working with a company called Explorati on massively multiplayer open world, and we were trying to have player-created content in that would then kind of go through teams of proctors to be vetted, and if it was good enough, then it would go into the game. And that still has potential, but we couldn't pull it off then, and we haven't. Nobody's really doing that now.
There's definitely there's so much to unpack with that discussion there. Like the first thing I want to bring up about kind of the non-linear aspect of games like Quest for Glory, King's Quest, like a lot of these adventure games, like one of the game market was. Oh, my headset go first.
With issues. Your voice is breaking up.
Oh, am I back? Test.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I remember I interviewed a Good Old Games about this, about why there is such a market for these games, was the fact that there were just so massive experiences. As you said, like when most people think about video games, it's a linear, do stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, you're done. But these games, you could spend weeks, if not months, just trying to get through them all. And it's why a lot of people have really resonated with them. The adventure games, Star Control, like so many of those very experimental games that came out like right around that heyday of the PC market.
Yeah, I played Heroes of Might and Magic 2 and 3 to distraction. Probably the point where it cost me a job because I was spending so much playing so late at night on it that I was, coming out of bed 4 hours later and going into work exhausted. And same thing with World of Warcraft. Completely addictive game experience.
Games can be immersive. I mean, that's the thing you want out of a game, is that it is immersive, that you feel like you're part of that world. And that's when you have everything there. It's a different style game, I would say, between the modern adventure game and the earlier adventure games, because the early adventure games were really very linear and very much you had to solve a puzzle when you came to it. There's nothing else you could do. You had to either solve that puzzle or you were stuck. And nowadays, most style adventure games don't have these massive roadblocks.
Yeah.
So, because as someone that doesn't have a very high frustration level, these roadblocks take me out of the game. And so therefore, my games are always non-linear. If there are puzzles and there are some roadblocks along the way, and you can't figure out how to solve that, well, go do something else. I mean, you don't have to. You're not stuck.
Oh, yes.
Back around 90 or 91, on-stage debate with Ron Gilbert about death in adventure games, and and Ron's viewpoint was that the character should never die because it breaks immersion. The player is playing this game, and then all of a sudden his character's dead. He has to go into an interface to restart the game or load a save game or something, and he's no longer in the story.
And in early adventure games, it was the easiest thing to do. If you don't have the resources to do everything, so if the player doesn't do what you want, kill them off.
Yeah, so
that's the way. That was a choice, and it was actually a pretty good choice given the restrictions of things, because we didn't have 3 billion resources. We couldn't animate, and we couldn't show everything.
Yeah, you wanted players to have freedom of action because you wanted the puzzles to be something that, really were a challenge, that there were so many different things you could do that finding the right one was hard. But at the same time, you couldn't handle animating and writing the solution to every possible thing. So what you did is basically, if the player did something really silly or stupid or dumb, you killed off the character. And that was a quick shortcut out rather than having to have an entire story grant.
And in the case of Leisure Suit Larry, it became the fun of the game.
Yeah.
I mean, dying in interesting ways.
There's some YouTube videos about funny ways to die in Quest for Glory, and
yeah.
We never thought of our games as particularly deadly, but people managed to find dozens of ways to die in the game. So.
But back to that argument about death in adventure games, my point of view was, if there is the possibility of death, there is a greater degree of immersion into the thing. You are invested on that character, and you are invested in keeping that character alive. And so suddenly, when this monster appears on the side of the screen coming at you, you actually have this adrenaline rush of, oh my God, I've got to get away. I have to do something right then and there. And your emotional and physical reaction to that brings you even deeper into the game. It's not just this casual, passive puzzle-solving thing anymore. It's real life, in effect. And that was the theory of how we designed our games in the first place, is to make it interface-free, as close to being intuitive to the player once they got, had to learn a few things. Once they did that, though, they should be able to play the game without thinking. They should be moving that character as though it's their avatar, and that's their character in this environment, and what do they want to do. And so therefore you have to design it thinking about from the player's point of view. What does a player want to do? And death in the adventure games meant that the player had consequence to their actions, because that meant if the player did something that was really stupid, like antagonize somebody who shouldn't have been antagonized, well, then the consequence of that is not that the game continued on. No, you fought with that character, or you effectively destroyed the relationship with the character, which had consequences further along in the game.
And it didn't actually have to be death. As Laurie says, you can lose the relationship. So it's dramatic tension is what it's all about.
Yeah.
And you need to have the player feel that there are some stakes involved, some consequences, and that it wasn't about killing characters. Never wanted to always make the player feel as though if he didn't do the right things, that he was important, and that if he didn't do the right things, then something bad might happen. And that could be the fear of the character dying. It could be the fear of getting damaged in a fight and then having to run around, weekend, or of just having a character that won't talk to you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually have a dead end in the original Heroes Quest, where you can get the healer to be mad at you, and then she won't help you with the items you need later in the game. That was a design mistake, but at the same time, sure showed consequence.
Yes. And I remember I had a conversation with Jane Jensen when this was around the time when she was releasing the game of Mobius. I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago. And we were speaking about how a lot of the adventure games were designed around selling strategy guides. Like that was like the major point there. Like make the puzzles as convoluted as possible, and we'll just sell the solution for $20 in the guide.
I don't think any of the designers ever intentionally made a game harder to sell adventure guides, but they certainly profited from it, especially Al.
Yes, that was the joke. Yes.
Yeah, the joke was that Al was making Leisure Suit Larry so dangerous, so he could sell hint books. But
because actually at that time, the designer wrote the hint book, and the designer got more money from the hint book initially than they did from working at the company.
Or at least Al did, because he got a sweetheart deal. We were second generation on that, and the Heroes Quest hint book Lori wrote, and she got a very solid royalty on the hint books, and made quite a bit from them. Sierra then quickly wised up, so for the second game they offered no royalties, but a flat fee for writing the hint book. And after that, they wrote in the contract that hint books are our responsibility in addition to designing the game.
And then they Then they just had a team doing it. So they made sure that if there was any profit from hint book, it went to the company, and eventually it went to somebody else.
So someone asked way back when, effectively, where do we get our ideas? Which is
at the beginning,
yeah, way at the beginning of this talk. It was Sebastian Eriksson said, "Love to hear a bit. Where do you find inspiration to feed your creativity?" And if you used to go to science fiction fantasy conventions way back in the long time ago.
Yeah, the
pre-computer game era. And authors hated it when people asked, "Where do you get your ideas?" And I said, "What a stupid question! It's not the idea; it's the implementation." And I used to say that. I used to say ideas are a dime a dozen. They're easy. Ideas come from everywhere. And lately, as I've gotten a little bit more mature, older, slower, stupider, ideas are actually pretty hard to come by too. Good ideas, good original ideas are hard to come by. But really what makes an idea is the implementation. When you put it together and say, okay, I have this kernel of an idea, and then what will usually happen is I'll make some stupid offhand remark because I love to do that. And Lori will say, well, that's stupid, but what if? And then we'll bat it out between us, and eventually we'll actually get an idea that's kind of cool. And then it takes months and years of lots of work and working with a team of artists and programmers and so on to take the kind of cool idea and turn it into all the details and make a script. So it's Thomas Edison's famous quote, genius is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Absolutely true of making computer games. So inspirations come from everywhere. My favorite example, and it's probably anybody who's read my stuff before has heard this too many times, but we went to the World Science Fiction Convention in Phoenix, and they had a cool kinetic sculpture outside in front of the convention center of fountains that were spitting water, and every once in a while one of them would spit the water out towards another one, and then a few seconds later that one would spit it out, and so on. And we thought that was just a really cool visual. And so I turned that into, Lori and I turned that into the spore spitting spirea puzzle. And I still don't know what a spirea is, but Lori actually knows something about botany in Heroes Quest. And then we just had to say, okay, why is that there? Why do we have, and then Lori said, there really are plants to do that. So it was logical. And then we said, okay, now how do we interact the character in that? And say, okay, you need to get that seed for some reason. It's very important.
So the spireas would spit a seed between the plants, and you had to figure out how to get that seed and get up to it, and it all depended on what kind of character you had.
And preferably not to kill the plants, right, because you were getting it for the dryad of the forest, and she wouldn't be too happy if you killed one of her plants.
So yeah, our puzzles are kind of come from everywhere, but then the implementation is, well, how do we make this work? What is it, how does it fit into the world?
We also did, the story in the original. When we came up with Quest for Glory, we said, okay, we want to make this kind of a cycle. We were looking at 4 games originally, and we said, okay, well, what comes in 4s? Well, there's the classical Greek elements were earth, air, fire, and water. So we said, okay, we'll do an earth game, an air game, and so on. I said, okay, we've got winter, spring, summer, and fall. All you gotta do is call.
Yes, and so therefore we
So we said we'd have themes.
All these themes into our games, and
we knew we wanted to have different settings. So we said, okay, for game 1, we're going to do in a standard Western Europe,
Germanic,
culture.
fairy tale, something that people would be familiar if they did any fairy tale readings. It was going to be something that
fairy tales,
players,
a Hobbit or anything.
Right,
yeah.
Players would be comfortable with, because most of our players would be from an adventure genre, and they wouldn't necessarily have the D&D experience in that. So we wanted to, sort of, give them something they know what what to expect, and then upend all of their
and then twist all expectations.
Yeah.
We actually decided early on the second game we were going to move to a different locale, and Lori and I have both always been fascinated with mythology and with fairy tales, and one of the great ones is the 1001 Arabian Nights that was from stories told in late medieval, early Renaissance.
And Persia.
And translated by Sir Richard Burton. So we bought an 11 hardback volume set of the Arabian Nights and proceeded to pour through it. And talk about Scheherazade.
Well, yeah, all of those stories, of Scheherazade and the Persian mythologies and genies and things like that. We brought that into the next game because we said, okay, we've let players dip their toes into mythology, with Germanic and fairy tales and that. Now we'll go to give them a different world and a different set of mythologies and things to learn about. And so that each of our games is an experience. It's a learning experience, and it's it's when you come into a game that I create, is there's this rich background underneath it. It isn't just this storyline set in a location. That location is integral to what the game is going to do and who you meet and how they react to you.
And with as rich and fantastic and amazing set of stories as Arabian Nights, how could we not take inspiration and ideas from that? They're everywhere. So we kind of picked out the best, and Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and Aladdin and so on. And 2 years after we released Quest for Glory 2, Disney made the Aladdin movie, and so it's quite clear that they stole our idea. Yes. No, they pulled it from the same place. And Tarzan came out 2 years after we did Quest for Glory 3.
It's set in Africa, and so therefore, yes, we always said Disney was just.
Beauty and the Beast versus Hero's Quest. They don't quite work. The remake maybe. But yeah, I mean, you've got so many rich antecedents. So the answer is how to get inspiration: read a lot, watch a lot of films, play other games, get out in the world,
do things.
Do things, watch things, and pay attention.
And take what you read, what sparks joy. Okay, to Marie's voice. Yes,
Marie Kondo.
Yes, if it sparks joy, put it in your cane. I mean,
and if it doesn't, throw it away.
Yes, indeed. And so, yes, inspiration comes from everything. It's a matter of putting it together and making it make sense.
So I sometimes think of games as wiring or plumbing. That you're the plumber and you're trying to get water from the intake into the sink. And so where do you run your lines? Where do you have to have a bend to get around the construction and so on? And so the player character comes in as the player's all those joints and valves and connections. And so we say, where is there a place that would be in trouble without a connection? Well, that's up to the player to solve. And then we put a puzzle there. So Lori thinks mostly in dialogue and characters. So we say, okay, well, here's a character. What's that character's problem? What's their story? What's their motivation? And how are they being thwarted? And then the player character comes along and says, I can help you with that problem. So it's our job as designers is to find those places and to provide them to players so that the player can be the hero and the player can solve the problem. We want a player to finish one of our games feeling like if he hadn't been there, the whole world would have collapsed. Terrible things would have happened if he hadn't been there to be the hero and solve those problems. And so that's how you make a game. It's piece by piece, months and years of sweat and work and throwing out, anywhere from 50 to 95% of the ideas you come up with and keeping the best ones. And then making it so it has meaning to the player.
And number one rule is the player must have. I mean, yes, even when we're thwarting the player, where we're definitely making him so challenged, or maybe bringing him to the brink of death. This is actually fun, It really is why we play these games. We want to be challenged, and you've got to challenge the player. But the trick is not to make it so tough that suddenly it's not fun anymore.
Yeah, I did a little bit of a playthrough of part of Castle of Dr. Brain the other day on our stream, and I got totally stymied on two of the first puzzles in the game. Trying to play on expert. It's the game I wrote. Yeah. And I was playing it on expert level. I didn't want to use any walkthroughs or hands, and I could have solved them. And playing alone, I would have solved them. But in front of a stream with 50 or 100 people watching, and say, I don't bore these people. I want to make it exciting and immersive and fun. So I will probably go back and play the game next time on novice level, just to show them a better idea of the game. And then after I've solved some puzzles at novice level, I can go back and say, okay, now here's what it's like on expert.
Yeah. And the puzzle design has always been a very fascinating part about these kinds of games. When I spoke with Ron Gilbert, he talked about the idea of the lock and key philosophy for that kind of the puzzle dependency charts, and it is very tricky, as both of you were saying, in terms of how much do you want to kind of hurt the player with these puzzles. And a few months ago, I tried to play the Seventh Guest for the first time. And my God, that was just a nightmare. I had no idea what I was doing. And then a friend sent me the solution of one of the puzzles. It took 5 pages of text to explain the solution. I'm like, wow, how the hell are you supposed to figure this out on your own?
Yeah. Well, we felt that Seventh Guest was designed to be a nightmare, and it certainly it was the moodiest, most dramatic game for us. And the reason was that we were playing it on an AT&T 300 that I had bought for a project 10 years previously, and everything moved like molasses.
Yes.
And we thought it was designed that way.
Head-stopping puzzle game. There is no doubt about it.
And I loved it.
I'm sorry, my headset kind of cut out there for 5 seconds. What were you saying about the Seven Guests and running on the computer?
We had a very slow computer.
And it made the beyond belief, because you came down off the stairwell and it gradually panned around, and I just thought it was choreographed that way. It
didn't occur to us, and we had too dark a monitor, so it was hard to make out anything in it. So it worked.
It was very spooky.
Yes, worked on a spooky level.
But as far as the puzzles, they were very, very tough, and I felt challenged by it. And I really wanted to solve each one, and spent a long, long time working on the puzzles. I don't think I actually completed the game.
Yes, we did. We did.
We did? Okay.
We played it together. We did not play this separately. A lot of games for us are social things. We played, for instance, Wizardry with a couple of different people with us, all playing side by side. The same character, same computer, but we were all the different characters in the game. So.
And Dungeon Master the same way. We had a friend that would our house, and I was typically the keyboard and mouse jockey, and then Lori and Kenita would pick out characters from the Hall of Heroes that they wanted to represent, and
So our game experience is a little different than some people. And those early games were extremely frustrating. And they were not something I'd want to play by myself.
And apparently so were ours, but we didn't know that. We thought we were making much easier games. We really went out of our way to make sure that everything you needed to know to solve a puzzle was present in the game, that it wouldn't require any outside information.
And that it felt fair. I mean, once you got the solution, it felt like, oh, I should have been able to figure that out,
Mm-hmm. Yep, and like making the puzzles in universe is very tricky to do for a lot of these games. Like, as you said, with inspiration, with pulling it from mythology and elements like that, you can build things around that. The problem, though, like, I've seen some adventure games go for, like, crazy solutions, like, you need to understand chemistry, or have a background in biology, and you will never know this puzzle otherwise.
Well, and then there was the ones, like, you had to find the one pixel that worked in the screen. So that to get down the whale's tongue in King's Quest, wasn't it? You had to find the uvula. Well,
you had to come up with the word uvula, I think, and say, climb uvula or something, or pickle uvula with the feather. So we learned some new vocabulary there.
Yes.
Actually, one of my greatest joys and triumphs, Sierra, was also one of the most terrifying and depressing periods I had. I finally got the opportunity to make my own game. It was only our third game, but it felt like finally, which was Castle of Dr. Brain. And this was a game that, I was going to basically look at a bunch of puzzle books and the type of puzzles they had in them and put them on the screen. And I started to do that and said, these books that are 100 pages long of puzzles only have like 4 puzzles in them. Repeated in different variations, and that's not enough for a game. And besides, none of them work
as a computer game.
So I had to come up with entirely different types of puzzles. Lori, meanwhile, was doing LifeSpring training and was off in San Francisco learning to personal effectiveness training. And I was completely on my own, and I just about gave up on the project. Called her on the phone. You gotta come home. And he said, no, tough it out.
Yes. Tough love there. You can do it.
Because that's what they were teaching her. And I hadn't had the training, so I wasn't ready for it. I finally managed to come up with some puzzles that actually worked. And a week or so later, when Lori came back home, she worked with me to help map out, one of the robot mazes or later mazes or something. Get through some places where I was stuck. So she definitely had a hand in the puzzles, but I really got to do most of it myself. And that was really empowering, as being able to make a game. But yeah, coming up with puzzles that make sense in an interactive environment is, can be quite difficult than creating a book of puzzles or whatever.
Yeah.
It is a real challenge.
Yeah.
I wanted to have more variation, but of course, very little memory and so on. So if I did Dr. Brain again today, I'd have either a database or randomly generated puzzles, so you could not read a walkthrough. You'd have to solve it each time.
And frustrated players.
Yeah.
Because you just know now, having played Castle of Dr. Brain, how you really good at it.
It's really hard. I would, basically sitting there on my own, I would work out. I actually gave people some tips on the stream and said, okay, so here's a magic square, and first thing you have to do is look at the numbers that go in the magic square and figure out what the total has to be for each row and column to make it work, and various other things. But there's also some symmetry things where, like the squares on the side of a magic square only have 2 different places that they add up, whereas the corner one has 3, and so on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But puzzles are hard.
And the center square is on 4. So.
And therefore, I don't have a lot of physical puzzles in the game. I have more mental puzzles.
Oh, I wanted to go back to, you mentioned something about Ron Gilbert about talking locks and keys and puzzle diagrams. On one level, every puzzle in the game is a lock that the player has to find the key to. And the key could be a physical key that's lying around somewhere. It could be a physical key that you have to buy or steal from the jailer or whatever. It can be a puzzle key that you have to, somebody has a keypad in the door, and you've got to come up with clues as to figure out what their code is to get in. I mean, there are just anything can be a key. Your chemistry problem, basically figuring out that you have to boil the water in order to separate the oxygen and the hydrogen. So and so. And I was going to say the one that requires insider knowledge of chemistry, that's fine. I mean, Dr. Brain was kind of an educational game for, kind of middle school students level, but you can have a game for people in a chemistry curriculum that they are expected to know the things or can look them up and build that in.
But the answer to the problem should be in the game itself. So it shouldn't require information that you have on the outside world, because you never know what your players are going to have. You really have to have it such that the solution to boiling the water should have been seen earlier in the game. It should have been just like, a Chekhov's gun, which is the thing. If you show something at the beginning of a movie, you better have it come back out at the end.
So the playwright Pavel Chekhov, not Chekhov and Trek, wrote an essay on crafting stories, and the Chekhov's gun basically says if you see a gun in the first scene of your story, then by the time you get to the final scene, that gun will have to be fired. Somebody will have to die.
So in making puzzles, it's the opposite. So you have the solution, but you need to have the Chekhov's gun earlier in the game.
The clues have to be there.
The clues have to be there. It has to be solvable, because a good game is its own self. It doesn't require outside knowledge.
So somewhere there's a beaker, somewhere there's a source of water, somewhere there is a Bunsen burner, somewhere there is a match or a lighter that you can use to light the Bunsen burner. All the ingredients need to be there in ways that players can find them and figure out that, these things can go together. And then at some point that, you basically would maybe read a page of a chemistry manual that says, here's how you separate elements.
So that's how to do it right. It's to make it integral to the story, i.e. that you're in a chemistry lab, you're not finding those things out in the forest, and also to make it such that all of the clues, all of the pieces are part of the game, and you have to uncover them, bring them to the right place, do the right things, open the door.
Yeah. So what you don't want is a puzzle that you have someone that looks hungry and you bring them a fish and they say, I got this key. Why don't you take it? Okay, because that doesn't have any causal relationship. You can find ways to build that into the story. If you discover the backstory of the person is that he was the caretaker of the old church, and then you find him as a drunk lying in the gutter or something, and you have to help dry him out and get him some food and so on. And then you get around to mentioning that. I really need to get into that old church. And now he says, I can help you with that. Okay, now the player's rewarded. Player feels that he's done something important, it made sense, and he's getting his just reward from it. And that's one of the reasons people play games, is because the real world kind of sucks. Okay, a lot of times there is not a proper cause and effect relationship in the real world. A well-written game, things make sense. You do the right things, good things happen. And when you violate that as a game designer, you're violating your players.
Yeah, in effect. I mean, you're robbing them of the experience that it could be. Games are not random. They are not just a bunch of puzzles thrown together. They have to make sense. They have to be stitched together with strong story and strong characters, because that's what makes the game world so immersive, and it makes the reason why we played the games in the first place. It makes it satisfying to play games.
Stephen Abbott, who apparently is a chemist at Abbott Labs, has torn my boiling the water metaphor to shreds, and I'm sure he's entirely right, and that's why I don't put chemistry puzzles in my games.
Thank you.
I was actually looking to see if you needed a catalyst for reaction and so on, and having last learned that in about ninth grade, which was umpty years ago,
Yeah.
about a half a century ago for me. I don't remember how it works. So,
and like you both said, like the challenge.
electrolysis. There we go.
There we go. We'll get into some chemistry here, everybody.
Real chemistry.
Um,
I had to do stock picking in junior high school, and so of course I picked one of the first stocks on the list because that was easy to find, and I picked Abbott Labs to follow for a month. So, so I know all about Abbott Labs.
There we go. But like you both were saying regarding like puzzle design and kind of crafting the experience for the player, it's an issue that I see not just in some adventure games, but in more action-based titles where the game asks you to do something that you don't even know that would be an actual option within that space. And like you said, Lori, like the game is supposed to be a crafted experience. Even like for games that are meant to be non-linear or completely open-ended, the player still needs some kind of guiding line, like the North Star to follow. And like one of the things for me that always like robs or kind of like knocks me out of a game is when the game is just, here's the world, we're going to throw you in it, and then goodbye, see you later, just go do stuff.
I've been frustrated by games for decades because of that. To me, all of the information to play the game should be in the game. And like with World of Warcraft, you get to a certain point at which you cannot solve the game unless you go to Wowhead, or there was a previous database before Wowhead. Get somebody another player to tell you what you have to do. And even like how to play the game is. We fortunately had a mentor when we were first playing the game who taught us what it meant to pull a mob and what it meant to kite and what crowd control was and all these things that without them the game is really, really hard.
There's clearly a place for sandbox games.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's an audience for it. Let's put it this way. So games like Sims, the Sims, The Sims, and that is there are people that are drawn to it, or what's the block game? Minecraft.
Minecraft, yeah.
Minecraft that have no plot, have no story. It's go in and create, and for a personality type that likes to do things like that, that's great. And clearly, there's a huge audience out there for it. But that's not exactly why we read books or why we go to movies. Movies are crafted stories, and so are books. And so the games that I like to play are crafted and have really a plot line that's going through them and a strong storytelling underneath, because that's what what appeals to me as a player.
Yeah, so I mentioned the importance of dynamic tension stories in games, but it's also there's a dynamic tension going on with games, and that is the needs of the story, the needs of the characters, and they're giving them good dialogue and getting a storyline that makes sense and has beats and has high points and low points and obstacles and so on, and the needs of the player who just wants to get through this whole thing and really doesn't want all those obstacles except when they're there. The player really can get some excitement and fun.
Once you accomplish these things that are roadblocks in the game, then you feel great. Yeah, there's this adrenaline surge. You feel great when you actually solve something, but when you're facing them, it's like, not another stopping point.
Yeah, you need to stimulate your amygdala.
Right. Really. So the game design is all about keeping this balance. You don't want the player constantly frustrated. You
want the player to have the illusion of freedom, but at the same time, you want their actions to make sense, to accomplish something, to have consequences if they don't do things they need to do, and to have rewards and accomplishment if they do them. And that reward in an adventure game comes in story progressing. So you want the player to feel like they're in control, but if you put them too much in control, most stories that if you put random elements together in stories, most of them turn into really bad stories. So you want to get good stories, but still have the illusion of control in there.
Yeah. And to Tower's point in chat, being able to craft the story yourself and have an effect on a wide scale is a strength of solo playing RPG games. And I feel the same way for like mechanically driven games that allow you to customize a character, that allow you to, build your own set of abilities. Again, that's a major point of pen and paper and tabletop style games. Yeah. That idea that I'm not just taking 4 generic characters who I've never seen before. I'm taking this group that, I've spent 50 minutes, an hour or more, fine-tuning every last detail of their sheet, their personality, what skills they have, and then let this world kind of be our little playground that we can go and do whatever we want with these characters.
Well, we've had, discussions like Maslow's hierarchy, where the idea is that, survival comes first. You have to have shelter, food, and so on, and then working up to the more abstract things. But what they discovered with working with monkeys and chimpanzees is they thought that basically these are dumb animals and all they care about is getting food and sex and sleep and so on. But what they discovered is that the need to master the environment, the need to solve puzzles, is really ingrained in at least all primate species and probably all mammals and maybe everything. They would put something in an environment and they would immediately start trying to solve how to open the cage or how to do things to get the food. And, the researchers thought, okay, they really want the food. And they discovered that, no, they wanted to solve the puzzles. Mm-hmm. And humans are very much wired that way, that we want that sense of mastery, that sense of getting better. And that's where role-playing systems work really well because, being able to improve your stats and skills and being able to take on challenges that were too hard for you earlier in the game, and maybe, and even in an action game, being able to breeze through a level that you couldn't solve before makes you feel like you've mastered that and that you've really accomplished something, and, makes us feel better about ourselves as people.
And I am, above all, a role player. My characters in D&D and that are vastly complicated characters with strong personalities, backstories, everything like that. And how that translated into my, computer games is that every character in the stupid game has to have a strong character, has to have their backstory, has to have their strengths, their skills, and their fallacies, their flaws, so that the player interacts with these characters as though they are real characters in a real universe, and that's the kind of experience I want from my games.
Yeah, when we were first introduced to World of Warcraft, which by the way is the answer to what kind of game we would have made if we had made a massive player game. It really is very close. But when we were first introduced to it, we were told that it was a big role playing experience, and then our friend that introduced Lori to it basically had her guild all stood around the fountain in front of the auction house in Stormwind and chatted incessantly, and that was their idea of role playing. And what they'd kind of left out was that they'd been playing the game for months, and us coming into it as newbies, they were all level 60 characters that had pretty much done all the content of the game. We were trying to discover the content of the game, and you get to about level 15 or 20 or 30, somewhere in there, and then all of a sudden the game is too hard to spend all your time chatting. You're too busy trying to survive and play the mechanics of the game to be able to really be able to role play. So we had all of our characters with backstories and interactions, but it becomes really shallow after a while because you can either focus on those interactions or you can play the game, and it's kind of hard to do both.
Interesting.
Is that a pointless story?
Yeah, that was.
Good, thank you. She loves me so.
And I think for that kind of puzzle solving, as Lori said, the player wants to feel like they solved it. I think one of the worst feelings is when you just brute force the puzzle, and it's that was the solution? I just spent, 10 minutes. If Shark is still watching, we were playing this adventure game or puzzle game, Filament, on stream the other night. and it's basically you having to like connect these various like pillars using like the like a string behind the character so they can't overlap. So at one point I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna just do like every single possible combination my brain can think of, and hopefully one of those will be the solution. And like eventually one where I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well I guess that was it.
But you didn't think it. You couldn't think it out.
Yeah.
You could just, it's hunt and peck, and that comes
And
down.
a lot of that is when the game doesn't provide you the clues for what you're supposed to be doing. So I actually watched a walkthrough of Hero Road to Redemption, and they got to a place where there are switches in the wall, and the person was just saying, well, this sure is painful because we've got to randomly try every combination of switches until we get through the door. Well, he hadn't gone around that area and looked and saw that there was a compass rose in the floor that showed him which way was north, and that in the next room there were 3 tombs, each of which had a legend that mentioned a compass direction on it. And if you put all that together, then basically all you had to do is the aha of up is not north, and you could solve that puzzle pretty easily. But it was really a hard challenge because that is an aha thing, to actually look at the floor and realize which direction is north. And he was annoyed by that brute force puzzle, but it wasn't a brute force puzzle. And I like to, in a role-playing game, to me, you don't really have puzzles. You have problems to solve.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that, there's an obstacle of some sort, a person that needs help, a monster in the way. It is a problem to solve. And then after that, it's up to the player to figure out what tools they have at their disposal and come up with whichever tools they choose to use. So, somebody playing a brute force warrior strategy might be just kill everything in sight until you get to the goal.
And that's fine.
And that's fine.
For that player.
If they enjoy it, yay.
But you have to realize when you're designing a game that not every player is the brute force warrior.
Mm-hmm.
Again, going back to WoW, because that's all I play these days. Some of the higher level Mythic Plus dungeons, you've got all these monsters in the way, and it's they're all obstacles. It's really just very tedious and time consuming. And one of the ways through is to kill every monster. The second level approach is to say, oh, wait a second, we can find paths that will be outside of the detection radius of the monsters, and we can sort of slip past them. The level 3 is you bring a rogue that has a mass shroud and can shroud the party. Or level 3.5 is you make sure that everybody coming in is prepared and brings invisibility potions with them. And so at the hardest parts of the dungeon, you stealth past all of the monsters. And then you have crowd control. You have a wizard who has...
Okay, yeah.
Can polymorph and so on.
Uh-huh.
So the idea is that basically you give each player a different toolkit. And in Hero Road to Redemption, your player is a rogue. He learns how to make traps and buys traps and so on. And he can use traps that will slow the monsters down so they can't attack for a couple rounds. He has ones that can completely freeze them in place, ones that can damage them, and has throwing things. So it's really up to the player as to whether he's going to sneak by things or he's going to trap things or he's just going to fight them all.
Yeah, so our theory of how to do combat for Road to Redemption was let it be a puzzle, but it's an open-ended puzzle-solving problem. You have all these tools at your disposal to use them as you see fit to try to get the monster. And so then it isn't just brute force, and it isn't just, stabby. It's really thinking about what the environment is, how you can use these tools at your disposal.
And we attempted to balance the game in a way so that stabby is a really bad solution. Because Sean is a rogue, he's not a warrior.
Yes.
And he's not that powerful. We actually had a complaint from one of our hardcore players who had totally mini-maxed his skills and got 100 in all the physical skills. Combat's way too easy. And we said, well, great, but we've got somebody else writing in who's a role player who's only gotten his skills up to the 30 to 40 range, and he hates the game because it's too deadly.
Oh, yeah.
So we really want that stealth player to be able to do his role playing and then get lots and lots of healing potions, get traps and be able to maximize his stealth skill and avoid 90% of the combats.
Yeah. And that's the nightmare thing when it comes to balance in like any video game. You're always going to have people like that. Like
Yes.
I play all the Dark Souls games. I play those very challenging, mechanically different games, and there are people who are like, I can't beat the first boss. This is too damn hard. And then you have somebody right below them say, I beat this game with the level 1 dagger. I did it all in like 2 hours. What are you talking about? You suck at this game.
Yeah.
Quit playing.
And nobody wants to hear they suck at the game.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, part of the reason that one person was critical of the game being too easy was the fact that I played the game and I'm not that skilled. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Oh my God, these combats are impossible," and so I turned them down. I nerfed them a little bit to make them easier for players. But we love our players. We really appreciate the feedback and hearing that this combat is too tough or too easy. And we eventually put in a difficulty slider, but probably should have had that in from the beginning.
Well, game design is a huge balancing act, and you're juggling chainsaws and bowling balls and and eggs at the same time. So you've got things
that's a metaphor for game design.
That's a metaphor for game design, because you really are juggling the fact that you will have your Uber players, the ones that will go through this whole thing, the one that will do every bloody thing that he possibly can do in the game, and that's their thrill and things like that. And then you've got the casual, who really just want to get to the end of the story. I don't want these things stopping me from just finishing the game. And you have to challenge both of them, and you won't be able to thrill everybody, but you have to try.
And I can also say that every game we have ever developed has been deeply flawed in one or more ways, and it's kind of tough as an indie designer, indie developer in really close contact with their fans, to be hearing about how badly our game sucks. And yet it's getting 80 and 90% ratings for everybody else. And we're hearing from other people that say, oh my God, I love this game. This is better than Quest for Glory. And we certainly like to believe that, we've gotten better, the decades, and that we're actually writing better games. But people have much more availability to communications now. It's much easier to tell everybody and directly to the developers the game sucks. And people kind of sometimes need to step back a little bit and say, well, you know what? Every game I've ever played has been flawed.
Yeah.
And do these flaws really ruin the game, or are they just, let's make a note about this flaw and work around it next time? Because, there are, as we say, Quest for Glory 4 was completely unplayable, and it's turned into one of our most beloved games.
Oh, yeah. And it's something that I've been looking at a lot, especially with how much things have changed in terms of game development. Because, again, there are people who will say, the classic games were perfect. There were never any bugs, Developers these days, they're horrible. They don't know how to code. And it's just like...
Yeah, I read that all the time in Quora.
Yeah, it's like they don't actually have ever played those original games, clearly.
Yeah, they said, why don't AAA game developers test their games?
It's like...
And it's like, yeah, they actually do. They spend months and months at it. They have dedicated teams testing on every piece of hardware. Of course, back in the late 80s and 90s, it was much harder because everybody had different graphics cards, and everybody had different sound cards or no sound cards. Some people had hard drives, and some people had floppy drives. So it was really a nightmare back then to test a game. But yeah, our several of our games basically either went out the door, almost went out the door, in what I would consider an unplayable state. Here We Are Road to Redemption, we put through a full 10 months of playtesting. We started with, we did it, funded it initially through Kickstarter, and we put our higher level Kickstarter backers as alpha testers, and our mid-level ones as beta testers. Eventually we lowered that to anybody that gave us $35 or more was a beta tester. And we got in hundreds, maybe thousands of reports of problems with the game. And we spent those months fixing it, improving it, tweaking it. and it was still flawed when it went out the door.
And here it is, 2 years after it's.
Yeah, we're still doing patches. Actually, we've just introduced some new bugs. If you get the latest download from Steam or GOG, you'll discover the gameplay is fine, but when you achieve stuff in the game, you get the in-game achievements, and you don't get recorded as Steam or GOG achievements. We're working on that. We put in the French translation and discovered that some of the menus, the boxes that had the titles, didn't have any text in them in English.
Yeah,
you always take 2 or 3 steps forward and 1 step back.
Yep. Bugs. They're there.
Bugs are a fact of life.
Yes.
So, I heard people, 5-10 years ago complaining about World of Warcraft, saying, they obviously don't do any testing in this at all. This thing sucks. And, even 2 years after they brought in the class halls in Legion, my Death Knight was able to walk through the floor.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, they are testing stuff, they are fixing stuff constantly, but some things have higher priority than others.
Yeah.
And you got to look at all the things that they did right, and that's amazing how much they got right.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm a glass half full guy.
All right. As a quick time check, we are just at an hour and 40 in. I am still fine to keep going if both of you are.
I kind of need a bathroom break, but I can put Lori in charge.
All right. I do want to talk a little bit about the design of Quest for Glory itself. I'll wait till you get back.
No, talk to Lori about it.
Yeah.
She's a great game designer.
All right.
Yeah.
The thing that I was interested in, this came when I was talking with Julia the week ago about Quest for Glory itself, was the idea of giving the player more interaction with this world. Because at that time, when most people think of the adventure genre, it was just pure puzzle solving. There weren't any stats, there's no real RPG mechanics to it. And I think Quest for Glory was either the first or one of the first to kind of implement the RPG systems. I really want to talk about where that
But the reason we wanted to be game developers or game designers is because we didn't like the games we were playing out there in computer games. They were, Ultima promised itself as an RPG experience like D&D, but it never delivered. It was just, okay, move your character, stabby, stabby. Move your character, stabby, stabby. There was no story or role-playing. They usually started out feeling like you're going to have a grand adventure. And we wanted to give players a grand adventure because that's what we wanted to experience in games. And so therefore, an adventure game to me is just, kind of dull. It is a lot of frustration of hitting your head, trying to solve a puzzle, and I didn't want to play that kind of game. I really wanted to have that kind of glorious storytelling. I am part of this game. This is my character going through the world experience. And so that's how come I designed the game around that.
Okay. What was it like, I guess, coming up with the RPG mechanics, and integrating that into the puzzle solving? Because like we've talked about, most games that feature puzzles are very much, the lock and key, they're black and white. Puzzle gets solved or it doesn't get solved and the player stops.
Yeah, we didn't want to have roadblocks. We wanted the player to be able to solve the problem from very many points of ways, because they didn't get stopped from enjoying the rest of the game. That's why we designed, to give the player options. And in the case of Quest for Glory and Heroes Quest, we allowed the player to choose the kind of character they wanted to play. So they could be the sneaky thief, they could be the stabby fighter, or they could be the spellcasting mage. And that meant they had a set of tools again. They had a set of locks of their own to open the
set of keys.
Set of keys anyway, of different styles to do different approaches to the problems rather than the straightforward puzzles. So therefore, we put problems ahead for the player to figure out how to solve.
And occasionally we would make the player the lock, give the player the lock and give another character. So we mixed it up a little bit.
Yeah. And I
then
think
the object was to make friends with the player so that they'll help you.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a very fascinating way to design the game. Because like we were saying earlier, part of the problem or where the frustration comes in is that the player doesn't know what the key is. They don't know what the actual options they have available. It's like, oh, you didn't know you could, jump up and down, quack your arms like a chicken, and then a dragon will come and grab you. But
yeah, and I wouldn't know that either. So it comes down to the player needs to have the chance to play. I mean, that's really what it's all about. Okay, what happens if I do this and something else happens? Something reacts to that. And therefore, you learn how to find spells in our games and you learn how to use. But you do that by, playing around, just seeing what you can do.
Now, that dragon chicken analogy can work, and the trick is to set it up properly. So you can have a farmer saying, darn dragons, they've been taking all my chickens. Or you can have a picture book somewhere that has, the dragon lore and that just shows an image of chickens flapping around in terror and a dragon. And once, if you've had something like that in the game, then, okay, maybe that's just a flash of insight for the player to say, maybe if I act like a chicken, the dragon will come.
Yeah. Well, there are always ways to make things work. You just have to, as a game developer, as the game designer, you have to think about them. You have to think about what dorky things the player wants to do, and what will have fun with, because it really comes down to what is it fun looking like a chicken, flapping your wings and going walk walk, and having the dragon take you.
Yeah, I mean that's an awesome scene.
If it isn't totally frustrating, so.
Yeah.
We worked with Bob Bates, Legend Entertainment, when we did the our game Shannara, based on Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara. In that one, Bob used the phrase, he said what he put into all his games, what he called error handling. And, to me, error handling is, keeping the game from crashing and stuff. But Bob thought about it differently. He thought of it as, we're telling a story here. And when the player deviates from the story in ways that, that don't make sense for the story, that's an error. And so what he wanted to do is gently handle the errors by putting down breadcrumbs for the players. So, for instance, in the opening scene of Shannara, you're in a clearing, and there's some stuff you need to do in that clearing, and then you need to move on from there to the east. So what happens if the player, right at the beginning of the game, decides to go home? He goes to the west or south, trying to get back home, and that's an error because it doesn't further the story. So at that point, we would put in text that gives a good excuse within terms of the storyline as to, I don't want to face Dad right now. He was really mad at me when I left, and I'm not going to deal with that. And so that gives a reason for the player's view, for the character's viewpoint of why he's not going to do that thing. And then when you do something that does further the story, then we give you a big reward, sound effect, visual, something to points onto your score that say, yes, you're making the story proceed this way.
I guess like my favorite, like the low energy version of that is like in a game where like every door is locked. Like I can't go there. The doorknob's broken. The door is locked, and it's like, oh, only one door in this hallway of 30. That's the one that's open. Well, I guess I gotta go over there.
We ran into a terrible problem with Hero U because you're playing a character who starts out the game as a thief, and you should be able to steal anything that's not nailed down. And we can't let you steal just about anything. So Josh Mandel had to come up with 300 different reasons why you can't steal things.
Yes, but we did go to the effort, of actually saying, in the old games, they just said, you can't do that. Sorry, I don't understand that. You can't do that. It just would do it that way. But we had to do it organically because we want our games to feel like real world.
Mm-hmm.
I could take the piano, but it would probably be a little uncomfortable walking around the town with the piano in my pocket. I didn't quite do that, but it was something similar.
And I know when I spoke with Adventure Game developer Francisco, this was last week. We were talking about how for a lot of adventure games, the protagonist is basically just a sociopath. Like they'll do anything and everything to get past a puzzle. I think the one we brought was the ever popular guard is stopping me. Guard is doing his job. Let's knock him out or let's poison that guard just so we can get into a place like an hour early.
That's typical D&D trope, actually. As the original Dungeons and Dragons, very formulaic. You got together a party of adventurers. You went down into the dungeon, and you proceeded to kill everything in the dungeon and steal their treasure until somebody started to ask, well, those kobolds, they had a family down there. You're walking into their home and slaughtering them and stealing, their life savings, and you're the heroes?
Yeah. Adventure games were notorious. If you could pick it up, you took it because you knew
you needed it somewhere.
Because if it could be picked up, it had to be usable somewhere. And we kept trying to,
subvert
those things. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's another popular option. Again, like going back to brute forcing puzzles, the ever popular. I'm just going to mash every object in my inventory with another object.
Oh yeah, and that was what we were actually doing with Shannara. We had this inventory, and you could combine things, and so therefore, most of those things didn't actually do anything. And with Bob Bates, he wanted you to have a response for everything on everything. And it's like, well, then that just encourages the player to do that, to my mind. You have to say, okay, well, don't reward them for having to do meaningless behavior.
I mean, ideally, though, you handle ones that are close to the right action. So if you use the fishing pole to try to get something off a high shelf, and you say, oh, it's just a little too short, you can't quite reach, and then you get, and that kind of gives you the idea that, okay, maybe tie the stick onto the fishing pole and use it that way. We did something very close but not identical to that. So the idea that if we want the player to combine two inventory items, then when he tries something that's almost the right solution, that's again the breadcrumbs, the error handling is you want to gently nudge the player in the direction of the right answer. Was it Ron Gilbert or Brian Moore? I think it was Ron Gilbert wrote the article on why adventure games suck about them. And he gave the example because he worked, LucasArts. They were working on some games based in the Indiana Jones movies. And he says, in the movie, you'll have a scene where, Indiana Jones is going through this door that's crashing down, his hat falls off, and just at the last second, he takes his bullwhip and snags the hat and pulls it through after him and, plops it down in his head. And that's a really rewarding thing that, you feel like there's that real tension that he could have been hit and killed by that, but
That's a movie, yeah.
Yeah, that's the movie. Now you put that into a game. It says most game designers, says Ron, get that puzzle entirely wrong because they think it's a timing puzzle, that the player needs to time that out properly and do things at the right time. And if he does it too late, he gets crushed by the door. And if he does it too early, then something else goes wrong.
Yep.
And 90% of the time, most players are going to lose their hat. And it says that's not satisfying to a player. So what he tried to do in his games was make it so that the player feels like he could easily fail that puzzle, but somehow miraculously, however he times it, the animation all coordinates to make it look like he just barely did it on time. And so that's the illusion of player mastery. Because you have some players that are not very good Twitch players. And you have other players that are so amazing at it that there's no challenge to them.
So as soon as they get that hat through the door closes. That is just a conceptual model that is like going to the brain. It's like, oh, we respond to what the player does instead of making the player respond to what we're doing. It was definitely a new tool in the game development, in our minds once we thought of it that way.
Yeah. And Brian Moriarty, the other Lucas designer, wrote Loom, and formerly had come from Infocom. Wrote an article, and one of the things he said is that making graphic adventure games is almost impossible because the first rule of a graphic adventure is everything that the player does must be shown. You have to dramatize it, and you never have enough memory or resources to show anything. So you have to show everything. You can't show anything. And so you really have to pick and choose your battles as to what's important enough to illustrate.
Yep.
And in CD-ROM era, well, we've got all the resources. Then you get into development resources. How many years do you want to spend?
Oh yeah.
Dramatizing things that only 1% of players will ever see.
Yeah.
And we're very good at that.
Yeah, we do a lot of that.
And
yes, I mean, all of our games are all of the Quest for Glory and the Road to Redemption are replayable multiple times because there's so much stuff you could have done. And in the case of Road to Redemption, a lot of that is mutually exclusive. You can either spend a lot of time with your friends, or you could be out in these sea caves, exploring the sea caves, or you could be doing something there.
Or you could go to the exercise room and improve your skills.
Improve your skills. So it's always a trade-off, and you never know what you're missing if you try a different route. And so therefore you can play it again because the game won't be the same when you try it again because there's so many options.
And I can tell you some of our players love that and some of them hated it.
Yes.
Yep.
We had players that wanted to solve the entire game on the first go-round and not miss anything. So they wanted to click on every single object in the game, which you can mostly do. They wanted to be able to do all the combats. They also wanted to be challenged by them. And they wanted to romance every character in the game and get through every storyline. But the thing is that, in making, the player have the feeling of autonomy, we tried to have enough paths through the game that you couldn't do it all. You had to choose between your elective classes of, chemistry first aid, or science first aid, or magic. And once you chose one of those, that was it for half the game. Second half of the game, you can choose the same one or another one and get the advanced class or another beginning class. And every one of these choices changes how the game plays out. And that's designed for replayability. We want players to go through. But since it takes about 20 to 25 hours to play through Hero U once, a lot of players don't have the patience to want to spend hundreds of hours in one game. Yeah. But we like to think we're giving their money's worth.
Yeah.
Yep, and
you don't really get enough gameplay from our games.
And that's always that very weird challenge when it comes to giving the player choices in these kinds of games. Like we saw this with Telltale and their adventure games that kind of like rose and then crashed majorly over the last decade. That on one hand, the player wants to feel like all their choices matter. They want that 100%. But on the flip side, as you said, like the game doesn't acknowledge it. Like if it's can't do that, can't do that. Can't do that, the player feels like the experience is being robbed by that kind of design. But then as you said, then there are people who are like, I want every choice in this game, everything to matter. I won't be able to 100% this game, and if I can't do that, then it feels like the game is cheating me.
Yeah, and so it comes down to the style of player.
Yep.
You can't satisfy everybody, but what was it? The person who complained that I think when Space Quest came out, one of the earlier Space Quest ones came out, and they complained that the game was too short.
Oh, it actually was Loom.
It was no. This was Space
Quest. The one I remember was Loom. That people called into the LucasArts hotline, their line, and basically said, this game's terrible. It only took me 4 hours to beat it. And so the very smart customer service rep there said, oh yeah, I guess so. See, fun time. So what about your game experience? So you were really disappointed that 4 hours was you didn't enjoy? So, oh no, oh my God, the game was so beautiful. That was, the most amazing 4 hours I ever spent playing a game. And then the person stopped and listened to themselves and said, I guess I don't really want a refund. But, people were used to typically, spending anywhere from 10 to 100 hours on a game back then. And if a game was too short, they felt like they hadn't gotten their money's worth. They realized that, oh yeah, they had a really amazing experience in that short time. And if they'd gone out to a movie, they would have only been there for 2 hours.
Games are a fantastic media, for entertainment.
I could just imagine the horrors of customer support lines for indie developers today.
Oh, Sierra published a few of the wilder ones in. You always wonder whether these are apocryphal, except I heard the same story coming from enough different places that I start to believe it, which is someone saying that your game's defective, disc 2 didn't work, and they say, well, what happened? They said, well, the game said to, I put in my starting disk, and then the game said to insert disc 2, and I put it in, it didn't work. And it was only after a couple minutes of back and forth in this, they realized that the player hadn't taken out disc 1. They shoved in discs 1 and 2 at the same time. And one person had crammed in about 4 discs into the floppy drive and totally destroyed the floppy drive. The other famous one was the cup holder.
Yes.
He said, I can't figure out how to use this disc, and they had been using the CD-ROM drive as cup holder.
Yeah.
So, all kinds of horror stories like that.
And it comes down to, players are of all experience levels.
And, and I tend to take things really literally sometimes, so I might do some of these stupid things myself. My Boy Scouts example was when I saw that the guy was, we were washing our pans afterwards, or this one kid got his pans super clean, and I'd been having problems with food sticking to it stuff, and so I asked him how he did, and he said, oh yeah, before I cook on it, I soak the pan. And so the next time I did it, I soaked my pan before cooking, and yeah, that food's completely inedible. No, you don't soak the inside of the pan, you soak the outside.
Ah, I see.
So that's how good a cook I was as a Boy Scout.
I believe these stories. I did a customer service at Comcast for 2 years, so I've heard nightmares that we could spend some time on those.
Yes.
Now, Loom was a really interesting game because he really did break a lot of the adventure game tropes. There's no typing interface, which at that time was ubiquitous. The interface is basically you can move around, which was the same as in other Lucas games, but you solve puzzles by playing music on your distaff, which was sort of a play between the distaff that a weaver uses to weave, and you were weaving melodies. And you clicked on it, and then it had, in easy mode, it showed the full staff, and in hard mode, it didn't show the staff, so you had to figure out where to click, and you had fewer clues on what notes you're getting. In the easy mode, I think it gave you the letter names of the notes as well as the notes.
So, yes, Loom was a very, very beautiful game.
And very innovative.
Mm-hmm. Does hold up for this, as a classic
sort
adventure
of. I played it last year, and it was kind of it wasn't that exciting.
Yep, and that's always a challenge, as you were both saying, regarding the different players going into these games. That you'll have somebody who can solve a puzzle or get through a game, very easily, and then you'll have somebody who just gets stuck, and that wall is never coming down for them.
No. Yeah. And you will lose players along the way. And that's why when you create a game, you really want to let the player know right from the beginning what to expect from the game, so that they're not anticipating something or that they won't get through the game, or that they will get stuck later on. You're better to weed out the players that won't like the game right from the start.
Oh, I'd rather weed out the griefers.
Yeah, well.
World of Warcraft, saw these stories about toxic behavior and all kinds of games. But a few weeks ago, I was trying to figure out there was an event that I thought had ended, still going. So I asked in general chat, when does this event end? And somebody told me, and somebody else came in and says, learn to play, noob. It's like right there. I said, well, no, it is. And he said, click on the eye icon on your screen and say, and fortunately, before I could even respond to that, someone else jumped in and said, once you have done the initial quest, which he's waiting for it to turn over to the new quest, the icon disappears and there's no icon to click on. It was like, well, go out to the continent map and click on the eye on the continent. And okay, yeah, sure, I could do that, but you would never guess that, and it's like you're an idiot because you didn't know how to do this. I have to laugh at anyone considering an addict who's played the game since the beginning to be a noob. But you can imagine that if I had been a noob, I would have run away from that game as fast as I could run and never played again. I actually it was Ultima Online. Ultima Online. I started in the game relatively late. Oh yeah, but EverQuest was a different way. But Ultima Online, I went through and did the tutorial. And you get out of the tutorial, and somebody was in there that had found a exploit that let them come into tutorial when they were an experienced player and infinitely raise the skill by doing the tutorial over and over. But I got into town. The town was almost empty at this point because the game had been out a few months. Your starting quest is you're given an item, and you're supposed to find another player and trade it with them. And that's to introduce your mechanics of the game and get into a social situation. So I tried to do that, and response from the first player I tried that with was, well, you're lucky that you're here in town where player versus player is turned off, because if you were outside, I'd kill you in an instant, noob. And people were just, the guy was so hostile and so rude. Well, I guess I never want to leave town then. And there were no NPCs because people had slaughtered every NPC in town. The town was empty. It was a ghost town, and well, that wasn't a lot of fun. EverQuest, I started up and got into, went out into the fields next to town, and immediately ran into a monster that was, like level 10 to my level 1, and it just slaughtered me repeatedly over and over. And it was like, there's no time to even learn the combat interface in this because, you immediately run into real-time combat with unbelievably powerful monsters. And so I don't know what I did wrong there, but obviously I was not playing the game the way they intended, and so I stopped playing.
Yeah, and in the case, we want our players to play these games. We want them to be inviting. We have to figure out ways to make the player succeed right from the start and realize they're on a journey they want to go on.
Yeah, but if they feel like the whole game's on rails, then they're going to get bored too. So the object is, again, to give, ideally some real agency to the player, and if not, at least a really solid illusion of agency.
Yeah, that illusion of kind of the choice is such a very intricate part of like these kinds of designs that, again, like even the most randomly or even the most that's a good there you go,
because I did laugh out loud.
Yeah.
Like even the most random or procedurally generated games still need, again, some kind of guide for the player, because if it's 100% chaos, that's not fun. If you don't know anything about what's going on, then you just die immediately. It's like, well, why do I want to keep playing? Why do I want to just, keep hitting my head against this wall for the next hour? Let me just go do something that it's not about banging my head against a wall.
Well, WoW stole this from an earlier game, but one of the critical things it does is there's a big, bright yellow exclamation point over the head of anyone who will give you a quest. And once you've solved the quest, the person who accepts the quest has a big, bright yellow question mark over their head. And players learn about that very quickly. I'm going to reverse those. you have the class of players that wants to be taken by the hand and guided through the game, and they will do is go to every quest giver and accept every quest and do exactly what the quest calls for and turn it in, and then get their next set of quests. And they're very satisfied because they feel like they've done something with their character and they've accomplished something and gone through the story. And then you have other players that will say, okay, quest markers, that's nice. I'm going to explore on my own and try to find the interesting areas of the map and try to find all the secrets. And there's actually there's a Discord group that focuses on finding all the secret hidden things in the game and solving them.
And WoW puts in impossible to solve puzzles, knowing that, and they really are next to impossible to solve, so that it takes
dozens or hundreds of
players to brute force it, and there are players that want to do that, and that's fine. But in our games, we don't have the luxury of putting artificial little question marks on top of people's heads, because we don't want we want the world to be believable.
Yeah, we want it to feel real.
And feel like what you're doing is natural. So we don't put in the artificial things to guide the player. We have to let the player be guided by intelligence, which is kind of like not every player is that intelligent, but the game assumes that you're going to have a certain degree of intelligence.
Well, we also want to, hidden things in discovery. Right. And the idea is that the player can play our games over multiple times. And, we hear people that, played our games from the 1990s that say they're still discovering new stuff every time they play.
And they're still
and that's kind of awesome.
Yes. And that's what we wanted to do with our games, is basically make our games a world that you want to return to, that there's always something you feel like you could do, or you could go back to talk to an old friend, because they have become a very personal experience.
And as I said earlier, we designed Quest for Glory to be a 4-game series. It turned into a 5-game series, but it's close. We were only a little over. A little, sort of like we're usually a little over schedule and budget.
You're right.
But we designed it from the beginning to have multiple game series, and our idea was that everybody would start in game 1 and save their character at the end of the game and play game 2 and so on. But there's a few marketing things we didn't quite take into account on that, which is that we don't want to have a game that sells 100,000 copies for the first game and 80,000 for the second and 60 for the third and 40 for the fourth, because you have to have played through all the previous games to get anywhere.
And you get attrition, yeah.
Yeah, so you lose more players at each stage. And of course, we didn't take account of the fact that it was going to take us 10 years to make that initial series, and that maybe the people that were playing in the first game weren't still playing 10 years later. And the people discovered the series in the middle and so on. So we tried to make it so each game, stood by itself and was playable and fun by itself. But if you did do the work to play them all the way through, you could actually take your character and have that role-playing experience of having your character all the way through the series. And we reinforced that a little with NPCs at different places in the games would refer back to your exploits from previous games. Or just, like a throwaway line that there was a, population explosion of antwerps in Spillward Valley, which the player doesn't necessarily bring that about, but one of the ways to interact with it results in a monster splitting into multiple baby monsters, and so we wanted to give the idea that there were some consequences to that later on.
And so, yes, our games have rich backstories, but the player is actively involved in creating those backstories as the series goes on.
Yep.
Yeah, so we tried to do with the journal in Shannara and in Hero U is the idea that as the player plays through their own individual path through the game, the game automatically fills in the important story elements into the journal. So if you want, you can go back and read that journal later, and now you have was originally a very open-ended story with a lot of branches and a lot of different ways you could have gone that is now told as a linear story that could have been a book.
Oh.
We do a lot with our games.
And like writing a game around like around like 2, 3, 4 game series is one of those very like odd things about the game industry, because normally we don't see that. Like it really didn't happen, I think, until maybe like the last 10 or so years, as the AAA industry really began this kind of serialization of their games. That it's not just Call of Duty; it's Call of Duty 1, 2, World War, Future War they did at some point, and they went back to World War, Assassin's Creed. This idea that it's not just you're going to make a game and think, well, maybe we'll do a sequel, maybe we don't. Now it's we're going to make a game, and if it's even like the remotely like an iota of popularity, we need to think about the next 2, 3, 4 games in that franchise.
Yes, well, that comes from the corporation
Yeah.
game company, and so therefore it's all about the profit. It's not about whether
I could argue that. Okay, it's also really about the fans, because even as we did Hero U Redemption, we said, yeah, Corey and Laurie Cole are doing a new game, in a new setting, and we're bringing it up to date to the 21st century. And I said, well, that's nice, but I really want to play Quest for Glory 6.
Yes. The one thing, you have the fans, and the fans that like the game want to see another game. And so therefore there's a guaranteed market, and it's a no-brainer for a marketing crew, for a corporation and one of the big companies. But on the other hand, you have the negative part of that, which is that, we can't risk doing a smaller game because we don't have a market for it.
Yeah.
We know that Assassin's Creed Infinity will have an audience, so we can afford to put money into that. But we can't put money into a product that we don't know what's going to do. So
yeah, Sierra came close to canceling Heroes Quest, because big and ambitious, expensive, so on. And then they, but we had a few champions in the company that kept it going, and then they were blown away with the, how well it sold. But it was a risk for Sierra to do a role-playing game when they were known as the Adventure Game Company. And Ken wanted to expand the market, so he took that risk. But it's always a challenge. I'd immediately say we were not the first people to do that. I mean, the Wizardry series had the idea that you could save your character after each game and import it into the next one. We also saw the problems that Wizardry ran into, because their very first game, Wizardry 1, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, you could get all the way up to the Tilt-A-Wait spell, which was basically a nuclear annihilation spell that you could cast by the end of the game. And how do you top that? How do you do a sequel and let a player gain power? The solution they came up with was to reset your character, so that you basically had like the son of the original character or whatever, or you had amnesia and you forgot all the start over fresh each game. But we built Quest for Glory intentionally, knowing that we wanted to make sequels, so we only gave you a few spells in the first game. We kept the power level pretty low, and set up a stat system that appeared to be percentile, 0 to 100, but was in fact just arbitrary numbers, 0 to 100, and we knew we were going to go up to 200 in the second game, 300 in the third game, and so on. So we left ourselves room to be able to add new spells and abilities, and be able to grow throughout the entire series.
because we knew from the start we wanted to tell this overarching story that would go from the first game to the last game, and basically make it a very satisfying experience. And we knew what the problems were coming into that.
But what we didn't know is that all the technology
We didn't know that every time we make a game, we're starting from scratch with all the things we thought, the expectations we could do are suddenly not the same reality.
Yeah, so Heroes Quest came out on 9 5.25-inch floppies, and they also crammed 4 720K 3.5-inch floppies into the same box. So there were a total of 13 discs in the box. And everybody we were on EGA 16 color, which a few years ago had been a big innovation because everybody had 4 colors or black and white. And we still were supporting the Atari ST, which had a monochrome monitor as one of the options. So our game had to be playable in black and white as well as color. And we did all kinds of stuff technologically with dithering the colors to work in certain color space and so on. So by the time we came out with the second game, at this point, it wouldn't possibly have fit on floppies because it was a much bigger game. But in the meantime, everybody on the PC was no longer using low-density 360K floppies. So we're now on 1.2 megabyte floppies. So it only took 4 1.2 megabyte floppies, but what about the Atari ST and so on had not advanced, so we needed now 9 or 10 3.5-inch floppies in the second game.
And not just the technology changing, but the way we were doing games at Sierra was changing. And so whether for the first game, I was basically in charge of the team. By the second game, no, there was a programmer lead, and then there was an artist lead, and then there was, by the third game, the artists are way over there, we're over here. Every time
actually, by game 2, I was the lead programmer at the beginning of Quest for Glory 2 until I burned out midway through. And I was not allowed to talk directly to, and my programmers were not allowed to talk directly to anyone in the art team. I could talk to the art director, Ken Nishue, and so a programmer would come to me, say, I've got a problem with this piece of art. I would go to Ken and say, hey, my programmer has a problem with this piece of art, and he would go to his artist and have them do something, and it would work back through the chain. And if you've ever played the game of telephone, you'd know how well that works. That the message, by the time it got back, was we never got what we wanted.
So yes, every time we made a game, playing by different rules, under different constraints, and under different frustrations. So it's always a challenge.
Yeah, our first 2 games were hand drawn. By the time everything was painted on boards and scanned in the type of overhead scanner that they use for Disney films for cell animation, and they had multiple level moving platforms and stuff for animation, and it was completely different technology. And so players who were playing through all the way from Heroes Quest 1 up to Quest for Glory 5 were pretty much on a different technology and a different development environment for every game. And it's a wonder that they have any coherence at all.
Yeah.
As a quick time check, we're hitting about 2.5 hours. I do have a few questions I want to ask both of you, but I would say maybe like the next 20-30 minutes we'll probably begin to wrap things up if that works for you.
Sounds good.
Sounds good to us, yep.
All right. And for the people watching us live right now, if you do have any questions for Corey and Lori, feel free to post them down below. But we've talked on and off about Hero U, and one thing that I wanted to ask specifically about the game, again, by the fact that it obviously was directly inspired by Quest for Glory, how, did you do anything different in terms of designing an adventure game, the last 4 or 5 years, versus designing the original Quest for Glory or designing adventure games back, again, in the late 80s, 90s?
All of it?
Yeah. There was a big conception change between what we were doing in Quest for Glory and what we were doing with Hero U.
What we thought we were doing with Hero U, and what we ended up doing.
Yes, there's, we just didn't go into this right away, but that's a whole long story in itself. But Quest for Glory is about an avatar. The player's avatar is in the game, playing the game however they chose. And so we never, in Quest for Glory, or very seldom for Quest for Glory, ever put words in the character's mouth. Characters reacted to what the player said, but the main character, the character you're playing, the hero, never actually says anything physically. Mm-hmm. It's just assumed, okay, ask about a house. And the respondent character would respond as if you had asked about the house. And we never gave the player a voice because we let the player, extend himself into that and ask the question in his own mind rather than give him a style of talking, which would define his personality. So we had, it was really a design nightmare in a lot of ways because we had a blank slate for a main character. Mm-hmm. And it was playing Monkey Island actually for the first time. I realized that I enjoyed the character of Guybrush Threepwood. I enjoyed playing through that game, and he had a character, a personality that wasn't like mine. And so I thought, maybe we can do this with Quest for Glory, and effectively we did. We made a central character that had a distinct personality, yet was moldable by the player. We gave the player the ability to decide how Sean was going to be. Sean could be snarky and nasty, or it could be sweet and lovable, and let the player impose the constraints of how the character is going to be and create the character. But at the same time, Sean himself has his own personality that is going to go through the whole game, and he's going to respond as Sean responds, not as necessarily what the player expects Sean to do.
Yeah, which is really going back to like Guybrush Threepwood in Secret of Monkey Island. We also designed from the beginning to have multiple, and basically, their reward system. So you're acquiring lira, and spending it to buy better tools and stuff like that. But time is a currency. You have certain things that happen at certain times in the game, like it's time to go to class, it's time to eat dinner, that you're kind of roped into. You have to go there, and you have a limited amount of time in between them to do things like explore the dungeons and find treasures and stuff like practice your skills, get better, stronger, and so on. The third currency was relationships, that rather than just having kind of canned dialogue in Glory, we instead had a thing where we had pretty extensive dialogue trees for every character. You could not go through, like in Secret of Monkey Island, and try out every single conversational line in every character, because it was supposed to flow like a natural conversation. So if you said to someone, tell me about yourself, and they say, well, I grew up in a small town, and say, well, tell me about your town, you would get into that line of the conversation, and you would not be able to go back and say, tell me about your horse. So we had basically relationship scores, a reputation score that each character had, and the idea was that you could build up relationships. You could even become lovers, tastefully handled off screen, with characters, and just really made the character interactions much more detailed than we could do in Glory.
Even though we had a central character that had his own personality, we did give the player autonomy for that character and to decide the fate of what Sean was going to do in the game, because there are multiple paths through the game, and Sean can, in the game, be the big hero who can kill anything in the game and defeat everything, or he can be the character who outwits everybody and outsneaks and has no friends at the end because he's so snarky and things like that. We gave the player the chance to play.
We also redefined the concept of a rogue intentionally. You normally think of a rogue's primary stat as being dexterity or agility, and that a rogue is a thief, and that they're out to steal things. And we instead decided that a rogue is a real hero class, that a rogue is basically a person who bends the rules in order to do good deeds, and that your primary stat is kind of the player's choice between either intellect or charm.
Yes.
And we had basically an agility path, a charm path, and a smarts path.
And they were not exclusive.
Right, but you would tended to focus on one. The one you focused on, you would improve faster. So if you kept coming up with smart responses and smart solutions, your intelligence went up faster.
All right.
So we really were building on what worked well in the Quest for Glory games, but we brought it to the next generation of iteration, effectively, of what we wanted things to do and how the world should work.
Yeah. And I think we wanted it initially to have a event-driven system where it wasn't really the passage of days, but it was more what things have you done that result in reactions. We found that that added a degree of complexity that was beyond our capability to do the writing. So Lori ended up restructuring the game and making it so that on day 7, certain things happen and characters react accordingly, and there's certain things you can do on day 7 and stuff like that. It's not quite that strict, but the dialogue options tend to change by day. So for the design document is, a mountain.
Yes.
That for every scene of the game, we say, okay, basically, here's what happens in this scene on day 12. And here's what happens on day 14. And here's the dialogue tree for each of those days.
And the iteration that made this possible was that we designed our own
design editor.
Our own design editor, so that I was actually in control of doing things like triggering writing when an event should be triggered in the code itself, rather than having to write a design document for some programmer to try to interpret what I said and put that down into code. So I was actually doing direct coding in effect with what we were doing. And so therefore it got extremely convoluted in some places.
And our programmers complained a couple times that there were bugs not of their making because we hadn't quite scripted things perfectly.
But on the other hand, it was far, far more complex than anything I could have done in Quest for Glory days, because the communication is there. Yeah. I mean, I was directly saying this would happen when it happened. As opposed to, like in Quest for Glory, where you couldn't become a paladin because a flag wasn't set in a certain room. And so, yeah, I was responsible for bugs. Oh, no.
I guess in terms, one thing I was curious about, in terms of, the audience who played Hero U, obviously we have a lot of old school fans in the chat today. How did, what was the response from new players, people who didn't grow up playing Quest for Glory?
We haven't heard from that many, but we've certainly gotten some really super positive feedback. We got a 14-page letter. It's by email, but when I printed it out, it came out to 14 pages from a fan who just really appreciated what we had done with alternate lifestyle characters. And the fact that we did not hit anyone over the head and say, this is a gay romance that you can have. But if the player took it on themselves to make friends with a same gender, ended up in a relationship, then it flowed organically and they just had a natural relationship. And so this woman who was, had basically felt different and ostracized all her life said, you really, by not making a point of this and just having options for every player to play the game the way they want, was so amazing that I was able to, get in my headcanon that, this is who Sean is. And, it would be totally different from somebody else, playing a traditional gendered cis relationship. That again comes down to problems, not puzzles. We give you the toolbox to have relationships with characters, just as we have the toolbox to open doors.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's very hard to write games or write stories like that, because there's always that challenge of, how much do I make the story around, my interpretation of this character versus how much do I make this around, the player's interpretation? Because sometimes, or very often, those two areas can just completely conflict with each other.
And that's why the one skill I have that's one of the greatest skills I have into this game that I developed is that I'm a role player. And I can put myself into the head of Sean and say, okay, this is Sean the snarky. And this is what happens when Sean is snarky and how people react to that. And then this is Sean the sweet. And so that each time I am writing a line of dialogue, I am literally changing my whole viewpoint of how Sean is and what Sean's doing to the other character. And so I have, this complex brain full of personalities that I have to invoke whenever I create a script. And it's not just, and every script is that complex that I have to think with each line of dialogue that I give the player an option with, how the game changes with what the choice the player makes.
Yeah, Lori's other real strength is designer. She has a phenomenal memory for her own games and can keep everything in her head at once. So when I was working on programming scenes from Quest for Glory, I would focus in on a given scene and try to make it play as best as possible. But Lori, meanwhile, kept the entire overview of the entire game in her mind at all times. So she would look at a scene and say, okay, well, in this scene, you are interacting with, a fox that's in a trap. And what consequences does that, what you do there, what consequences does that have in the rest of the game? And so we would set a tag or a flag that says rescued the fox or killed the fox or whatever you did. And then later on, in some entirely different part of the game, that would have reactions and consequences. So with Hero U, there was this immensely complex script with things going on with all these different characters, different sections of the games, and so on. And Lori can keep that all in her head and, at once in some way that I've never been able to fathom. But the real answer for how do you make a real huge complex game like this is you spend a huge amount of time and effort and sweat and play testing on it, because a lot of things, as a designer, you're come up certain paths through the games, but your players will try everything. So
yes.
You really have to listen to the players and get their feedback and say, I guess we should have a path through it.
And as a designer, you have to ask yourself, is this the kind of game I want to play? And most players most game designers do not design games like I do. It's just my strengths are those things. The ability to have a very complex game and have multiple personalities for your same character is second nature to me. And most game designers don't have that kind of, desire to create that situation because, it's nuts. It is absolute nuts to do games the way I do it because they're overly complex. They are a niche audience. Only certain people can really get into those kind of games because they're all talkies and very little action in the modern games. But yet, for those players who find this game and love this game, that's the one I'm creating it for. The ones that actually respond well for what I am creating.
And Sierra Lori talked about the building a relationship between a producer and a game director, and felt there had to be a certain degree of antagonism there. That the game director is responsible for, coming up with and supporting every crazy idea in the world and getting everything in the game and making it be the entire world. And the producer is responsible for coming in and saying, no, we have a budget, we have a schedule. Unfortunately, it's absolutely impossible for me to order Lori.
Yes, and as independent game developers, you have to be both.
Yep.
Yeah, you have to basically be willing to turn off the valve yourself and say at some point, you know what, it's time to get this game out the door.
Yes, and turn off your own creativity. Oh, I really got to have this, or this is so cool. Let's go this way. No, you can't do that. You can't have everything you want. And so that's another huge skill set that most people, have a hard time dealing with.
Yeah,
and even with what was I going to say? Even in terms of known bugs, and every game ships with a list of known bugs. And why don't you fix those? It's like, well, if you know if you bug, why don't you fix it? And the answer is that you just at some point have to cut it off because there will always be more bug reports coming. So you have to say this game is good enough, and yes, we know there are some flaws in it. Hopefully, we will eventually get a patch in for that, or we'll live with it.
Yep.
So you just have to know when to cut that off. And in the case of Road to Redemption, I estimated 1 year for completion of that game. And I did that based on looking at Double Fine Adventure, and they estimated a year. And I said, well, if Tim Schafer can do it, so can we. And it turns out that it took Tim Schafer and his team of about 80 people 4 years to make that game, and it took us and our team of a dozen people 5.5 years to make our game.
Mm-hmm.
But, we were used to, Sierra, if you need more people, they throw them at you to a degree. As an indie, you don't have budget for that.
Yeah. And like you said, like, it is a very big challenge for a lot of indie developers. Like, we could easily segue into just like a greater game design talk. If you want to sit for another 3 hours, we could easily talk about that. But it is one of like the more interesting challenges of being an indie developer these days. Like, again, for both of you, you've been making games since the late 80s and the 90s when, the tools were limited. Again, we had the whole discussion on floppy disks. Most kids these days have no idea what a floppy disk is. I gave a presentation at a library last year. I said, back in the days, we had dial-up modems, and you couldn't be on your phone and use the internet at the same time. And she looked at me like I was just describing witchcraft in the 1600s. And
even the term floppy disk is a misnomer, because 5.25-inch disks were thin and they were floppy. 3.5-inch discs had a hard case, but they were still called floppy.
Yeah.
It is. It's even more confusing for them. And the constraints that kind of were a major part of game development for like 20, 25 plus years, they're not really there anymore. They've been replaced with new issues. Like you both have said, like, these days, you can do a lot with a small team. But now your challenge is, how do I get this game to people? How do I get people to actually know what this game is? And again, like, I've spoken.
The answer to that, we'd like to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would. We're trying. Shark and I were trying to do a video series on that. Maybe we'll stumble upon that magical solution. But it is tough. Like, I've spoken to developers who spent 3-5 years on a game, and less than 30 people actually purchased it. And it is scary as heck out there.
Well, those big AAA games, I've read that companies budget for the marketing budget for the games, and quote marketing, some of it's pure bribery, anywhere from 40% to 100% of the game development cost. And we had very close to a zero marketing budget for Hero U. So it's actually kind of amazing that anybody has found. But my son works in in internet marketing. He said basically it is not worth spending money in advertising itself. And people either find the games organically or
you have word of mouth.
Yeah.
And it's really about the word of mouth and creating communities that every game designer needs to create their own community. We went in when we did our first
Kickstarter.
We thought we would get more of the role-playing crowd, because we were going to gear the game more for role-playing and not be the grand quest for glory adventure game that we want that we had done in the past. But we found we didn't get new role players inspired by what we were showing. We got the adventure gamers who'd played Quest for Glory.
Yeah, we got a lot of people that said basically, well, I'm not actually interested in this concept, but it's the Coles. I want to support them because I love Quest for Glory. And so they came into the campaign. And gradually, as more and more people came in like that, they said, well, what you're doing with tiles and so on looks interesting. It's really not that pretty.
It's not Quest for Glory.
Yeah, it's not Quest for Glory. We want to see, Sierra full backgrounds and so on. And people also balked when we said we were going to do the game in 3D.
We weren't initially.
Well, initially we weren't going to.
So, yes, this is all.
It evolves.
Yes, it evolved all the way.
Yes.
And it evolved because of the people that came in and supported us in Kickstarter. And they were our community. And so, therefore, we needed to design the game more for their taste than for a general market. And for the larger role-playing market, we were going to go for initially.
Yeah, they gently nudged us in the direction of making games similar to what we did in the past, and said because that's what they really want, and we don't mind those games. I mean, Quest for Glory was an awesome experience in our lives.
Right.
But we don't own the rights to Quest for Glory. We cannot title it Quest for Glory.
Right. But my point is, it's the community.
Yes.
We had a community behind us, and it's the community that meant we have a market for our game. And unless you have a community behind you, it's very hard to make any effort to make any mark in Kickstarter. I mean, and you will not get financed for Kickstarter just because you go on Kickstarter.
Yep.
You really have to get people enthused about what you're doing before you even go to Kickstarter.
Yes, that was one of the big things that people must. Kickstarter is not a community that will go out and look around for interesting games, support them. You have to bring your community to Kickstarter, and Kickstarter is a tool that will support your game.
Yep.
So we're using something called BackerKit. I put a link to it earlier for fulfillment. And I went to a BackerKit webinar where they had a number of people that were using your services. One guy was saying, I've got this card game that I've come out with. It's, everybody's played it, loves it. It's incredible, but I've only got 30 people supporting it on Kickstarter. And the answer was that he hadn't brought his community there. There are board games there that sell tens or hundreds of thousands of pre-orders, and they're ones that brought the audience with them. That people know who they are. So if Wizards of the Coast were to put a game on Kickstarter, you better believe an awful lot of people will find it there.
Yeah, and it's the same thing just in general game development these days. That just making a game is not enough anymore, and it's one of those things I think a lot of new developers don't really think about. Like, we've said this many times on these casts, that 15 years ago, you put a game out, chances are you're going to succeed just by the fact that there weren't too many games being released. Again, Steam for the longest time was just the golden ticket. Get on Steam, it's a guaranteed success. Today,
and of course, we had the life of privilege that, because we were well known for Quest for Glory, that we went to GOG and they snapped us up an instant. And we went to Steam and they said, "Yeah, we'd love to have you on there." And then they added the greenlight process, and we went into greenlight and got greenlit in a very short period of time. So yeah, we had the golden ticket, but it took us 5.5 years to make the game. And by the time it was out, Steam was letting anybody put games in Steam that wanted to, and it no longer had that air of exclusivity.
Suddenly the market is wide open, and anybody who has a computer could make a game.
And that's not a bad thing. I mean, as I said, we were living the life of privilege as being the famous game designers of the 90s. We have a built-in audience, but there's no reason why we're not that much more special than anyone else. People know who we are.
Yep. And it's something that I hear from other indie developers as well. Like, I spoke with Rami Ishmael from Vlambeer, and he told me straight up that if he were at least the exact same games he made, that he got famous for, Nuclear Throne, Lufrausers, and other ones today, he probably would have failed. Because the market has changed so much, and like you said, you have to be able to grow and evolve as a developer. You can't just be standing still if you want to be able to survive this industry.
Yeah, people, you go to the fans and you ask a fan what they want to play. They will tell you they want to play something just like this. But when they actually get the clone to just like this, they find it isn't very much fun. It's not what they say they want that counts. You have to be creative. You have to be innovative and give them something they weren't expecting. Because if you just give them the same old, really will get bored. It's just human nature. Mm-hmm. So all of game design is a constant battle of trying to figure out what do players want, and it's impossible to tell. So you have to say, what do I want? What would I like to see? What would be exciting for me? What have I learned from this past experience? This is, I can do better than that. And by being that kind of person to push yourself forward and say, oh, what if we, this is what I think would be exciting. You have to hope that you have the right, an audience that will follow you.
Yep.
And you have to teach them, this is what we're going to do. This is how much fun it's going to be. And keep them involved such that they help drive your product too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
someone just wrote in our Discord, the Transolar Games Discord, that the game Secret of Mana was, immensely beloved title on the Nintendo. And when they re-released it for modern consoles, their fan base came back and said, don't change a thing. The game was perfect. And so what they did is they improved the graphics a little bit and some very, very minor cosmetic changes, and expecting that all those fans had said, give us what we had before. And what they discovered is it was completely panned by fans and critics, players and critics, and it said basically, this game sucks. It's got all this 1990 level, or 2000 level crap in it, and it's not. Why didn't you improve the game?
Yeah.
And the thing is that people today are not the same people that were playing the only 30 games that were out 30 years ago.
And and people look back on those games with nostalgia because they love doing it. They don't realize how boring those games, some of those games really were, or repetitious, because that was, we've been there, done that.
Yeah, that was how they stretched out the the game playtime.
Yeah, it's like, okay, World of Warcraft brought out World of Warcraft Classic. It's like, I was there when it was Classic, and and I know how much better the game is now.
Yeah, we don't need to step in that same stretch river a second.
Yeah, all of the things, the reason why World of Warcraft is still out there to this day is they kept saying, what's wrong with what can we do better? And they don't always get it better, but they always keep changing and keep growing. And that's that's just human nature. We want to grow. We want to get better. We want to do things differently. And so if you try to make a game that appealed to somebody back in the 90s, you're going to find that, we're not those people anymore.
And like another point I see a lot of indie developers stumble on is when they try to recreate a game from the late 80s, early 90s, and that's their stopping point. They don't do anything more beyond it. There's nothing wrong saying, I want to make a Final Fight or I want to make a Pong. But if you're expecting that to be something marketable today, you have to do something more with it. You have to be able to say, this is my interpretation of Pong and I'm doing this differently.
And that's what game development is. It's really taking
it's structured imagination.
Yeah, structured imagination. Okay. It's also taking what you've already done before and making it different. And no artist wants to do the same thing over and over again. They want to learn a little bit more and do it a little bit better next time. And really, game developers are artists and they're game players, and they learn as you go to make it even better.
Yeah, and it's also hard, you need to take feedback from the players, but you've got the player who originally played your games when they were 7 years old, and they remember it with the lens of what it felt like back then. They're not really remembering the same game that a 30-year-old is playing. And as I said, we went out of our way with the Quest for Glory series to try to make them fair and internally consistent, and relatively easy, low puzzle games, and the feedback we've gotten is, oh my God, those games were so hard. It's practically impossible to figure out what to do here. And so on. We said, oops, it wasn't the game that we thought we were making.
Well, and then of course you have to say,
or maybe it was.
How old were they at the time they were actually playing this game? And yes, a parser-based game where you had to type out your commands is 100% harder than one where you point and click. And designing the game is totally different when you have to do a point and click game as opposed to a anything goes parser game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah, we've all had to grow and change and do things differently.
And I think with that, as we're just about to hit 3 hours, again, these casts can run. Definitely want to thank both of you for being more than willing to chat with me here tonight.
And people will probably see me starting to nod off here. I was famous for being in a 30-person meeting at Sierra and nodding off in the middle. So,
But if you two are free in the future, I would love to have you back on again, talking about design and more about with Hero U.
We'd be glad to. We really enjoy talking, telling about these things, and
Mm-hmm.
because good questions make us think.
Oh yes.
I mean, that's the whole point. Is a lot of the things you do is, with writing or that is all internalized, and you don't actually think about what you're doing when you do it. You just do it. So having people ask you questions or talk about these things mean you have to actually conceptualize and put into words what you're doing instinctively and under the cover effectively.
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the other part of game design. Write it all down.
Yes.
Or at least record it in your brain.
Yeah, I've been forced to use my calendar to make sure I keep track of all these casts I've been doing lately because of all the time we have.
Yeah.
Before I let you both go, just a few quick questions about what's coming next or what you're working on, and then that
Okay.
will do it. So we've spoken about Hero U. What are you working on besides? I know you've talked about translating the game to other languages. Are you working on any new games?
Well, originally, Hero U Road to Redemption was part of a 4-game or 5-game series. And we really do want to make that series of the same kind of game, a complex adventure role-playing game set in the School for Heroes, which involves a different character class. The next character class will be a wizard,
Mm-hmm.
but it'll be a female protagonist, and it'll be a totally different story than what went on for Road to Redemption. And we want to do that game, but right now we don't have the
We don't have the $2 million that
we
it
don't
costs
have
to.
yeah.
Uh,
So, as an interim, we're actually doing another entirely different style game.
but it's still a Hero U game.
It's still a Hero U game. It's set at the same school. It's set in a different time than what we did with Road to Redemption, and its style is more like the story adventure game style. That yes, there we go. Summer Days at Hero U, and that is the name of the. And it involves a choice of which character you want to play. Who goes through there? One is a female rogue, and the other is a male wizard. And it goes through 12 days of their lives at the Hero U, and all their interactions and all their conniving and things they do to try to make a harvest festival. So it seems like a very simple plot, simple, straightforward, a bunch of characters. It should be a very easy game to. Except that you should have been.
Or you got our hands on it.
Yeah, but it's a very complex game. It's like, okay, you have a choice of which characters you want to interact with, who you want to get involved, how do you go about accomplishing your goals, and it becomes, really a very different style game than anything we've done. Same time, very much like, the kind of thing that Quest for Glory ultimately is. It's a character-developed story.
Penny Arcade said it best that game development is a Sisyphean nightmare war on. So.
Do you see yourselves going back to Kickstarter for any other games?
We've done Kickstarter 3 times now, and every time we went to it, it is partially to get the money, and well, it's always to get the money, but it's also, in addition to getting money, is to create that community and revitalize that community, because it's critical. And we really, Road to Redemption had a huge influx of people giving us money for things, and their suggestions and their things that we had in the game, like they could have portraits in the game, and they could have monster levels in the game. All of this became integrated into the game and became part of the game. And in fact, Road to Redemption would never be the game it is today without those fans adding into the game and giving more ideas of what should go on in the game.
It added richness and depth, but at the same time, we didn't learn our own lesson from game design that time is a currency.
Yeah.
And that getting in all those images, getting the story of every character in the game was a major part of why the game took so long to develop.
Yes.
But it's much richer for it, so it's worth it.
And and Kickstarter gives us a chance to communicate to an audience. It brings the community back together for a common goal. And so and you start to talk to people and let them know what you're doing. It's the most invaluable marketing tool that we have. And that's in more than all the Facebook groups that we have, and that the Kickstarter groups are the ones that really make sure that we make a game.
And we had thought about switching to Indiegogo campaign. Who knows? Maybe I should have. We talked to Fig at one point for financing the Nintendo Switch conversion of Rogue Redemption, which, by the way, is something we are still working on. But we didn't really get any leverage. So it's really challenging. There's a lot of different ways to fund the game, and none of them actually fully funds the game. If you work with a publisher, you get a pittance, and they expect you to meet all the milestones, exactly. And a lot of times they'll come back and change requirements for a milestone a week before the milestone, like that. So it's any way of funding a game in development. There aren't really any shortcuts.
Yeah.
But Kickstarter and the equivalent crowdfunding things, have given us a connection with the fans that is really valuable.
Oh yes, definitely. And again, like as we've said many times over, like you can't be developing a game in a bubble these days. You need to have people, wanting to play your game, giving you feedback, and again, being able to shout to the world that your game is out there.
Exactly. And you need other people. You need those people to talk about it. And so, yes, I see so many names, sitting over there in the chat that I recognize right away. And Roberta Vaughn is one of our best publicists for our game. And it's that, interaction and having the fans really be the push for for marketing our game.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also made new friends this way.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely, especially I know the same thing. I have a lot of people in my Discord channel. I have regulars too, and they help lift you up when you're trying to do this stuff.
Exactly, it's what keeps us going. Unlike the old Sierra days, in that where you were literally at Sierra, you were designing in that vacuum.
Is that the same thing as Etsy?
Nobody could actually see what you were doing. Nobody could figure out what the game was going to be like. And you never knew if the game was good or not yourself until, somebody else finally, it's almost all put together and somebody could actually play through it. And even then it sucked until somebody put music over it, and suddenly you have an emotional overlay that brings the game together. Mm-hmm. So you had no clue. You'd been working on this game all the time. You had no clue whether it was good or not. And that meant you had to, basically have the wherewithal to say, yeah, I'm sure this will be good. I'm sure this will be good. Crossing your fingers the whole time because you don't know.
And when you get critical reviews, you still don't know whether
Oh, yes.
The reviewer in a bad mood or whether the game's bad.
And so therefore, in this modern day and age, you don't have to play, you don't have to just, you could say, okay, here is some ideas I've got going. You could display it to your fan base and say, here's an early access thing, and this is
Minecraft is the ultimate success story of that, where he basically had just an idea for a game and a completely unfinished game. And then as people played it and made suggestions, he refined it.
So yeah, the advice to anybody designing a game today is make sure you develop your group, your people, to be your mirror, be your feedback loop, be your cheering squad, because you're going to need it. Because it just isn't easy ever to make games, and you do need somebody encouraging you to continue when you're in the dumps.
Yep. All right, so I think with that, again, like we could sit here for who knows how many more hours to talk about this, but my final point for you, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching to end this cast on?
Well, other than thank you, because you're why we do this.
Yeah. So thanks for being here, and game. Check ours out. Check out the Crimson Diamond, and coming up, we'll have Space Venture coming up real soon now, and people have given up on it. No, because game designers care. We're not soulless corporations. I think most soulless corporations either.
No, there are always people. The game designers that are working for those are really want to be there because otherwise they're going through hell for nothing. So yes, remember that you are the reason why we keep in business, and without you, there would be no games.
Right.
Thanks, Jan. So seriously, your interviews, your dreams to us, we love you.
I think that is a perfect note to end this cast on for tonight. So, Corey and Lori, thank you again for coming on. Best of luck with your next game and whatever else you have planned in the future.
Thank you. We enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
All right. If you wouldn't mind hang on the call for like 30 seconds after we hang up, we just have a few post things to go over with you. But other than that, one last thing. Do you have any social media you would like to plug for anybody watching this right now?
We're in quite a few places. We're on Facebook. It's facebook.com/The School for Heroes, but just search for Hero-U and you'll find it. We're on Twitter as Transsolar Games. Our major media that we're using these days is Discord, so we have a Transsolar Games server on Discord. Roberta, do you have a link to that?
Yeah.
So you put it in the sidebar.
All right.
We just had a package arrive.
All right, and I'll include links to that stuff in the recorded version for people watching this in the future.
Oh, good.
Sounds good. Really appreciate it, Josh. Thanks for having us on your show, and we enjoy both reminiscing about the good and bad old times, and also, just as Laurie says, these questions make us think and refine our own skills. We're always learning. We're always growing.
Awesome. So, for the people watching us now, thank you for tuning in. To follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBeister. We have a Discord and Patreon link down below. The Discord is open to everybody. And if you would like to, if you are a developer working on a game, like to come on talk design, please get in touch. And we're always looking for more games to spotlight here on Game Wisdom. So, that's going to do it for this cast. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Have a great night, everybody, and we will see you all next time. Take care.